This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome everyone to today's Economy Committee meeting. Members of the public may like to know and follow us at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag Assembly Economy for this meeting. Please may I remind everyone to switch off their phones or switch their phones to silent mode, and ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of the microphones, as this could cause problems. Members and guests are also reminded to position their microphones so that they can be heard clearly. If you need to move your microphone, please do so by picking it up from the base, because if we pick it up from here, it breaks and the tech people get very, very upset. Today, our main item of business is on London's post-pandemic labour market and working practices. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our committee clerk, Jack Booth, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies for absence from Assembly Member Clark, for whom Assembly Member Baker is substituting. Additionally, in accordance with Standing Order 2.4, Assembly Member Polanski is attending virtually.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note could I ask, are there any declarations of interest, and can I ask the committee to note the recommendation set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Sorry, yes. Do you have any more items of interest to declare? Thank you very much. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 23rd of May to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions from previous meetings?
Noted.
And can I ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor to its report, Food Insecurity, as attached at Appendix 1?
Noted.
Can I also ask the committee to note the response from the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills to its letter on barriers to work for asylum seekers and refugees as attached at Appendix 2?
Noted.
We now move on to our main item of business, a discussion with our invited guests on London's post-pandemic labour market and working practices. After the first set of questions, we'll have a short adjournment around 3 p.m. For 10 minutes, comfort breaks, I think they're known as, and I'm very pleased now to say that we're joined in the chamber by Alex Conway, the Assistant Director for Economic Development and Programmes at the Greater London Authority. Welcome, Alex. Becky Newton, Director of Public Policy Research at the Institute for Employment Studies. Welcome, Becky. Matthew Jaffa, Senior External Affairs Manager at the Federation of Small Businesses. Welcome. Naomi Clayton, Deputy Director for Research and Development at the Learning and Work Institute. Welcome, Naomi. And Sam Gurney, London Regional Chair at the Trades Union Congress, TUC. Welcome, Sam. And thank you, all of you, for coming to join us as our guests. So, I will start off with questions. My first questions will be to Becky and to Naomi. And what I would ask is for all of us, both for committee members and for panel members, if we can keep our questions and our answers as succinct as possible, because we've got a lot to get through today. So, Becky and Naomi, what has been the long-term impact of the pandemic on levels of employment and economic inactivity in London? And Becky, perhaps you'd like to start. Sorry, I should have said we switch it on, and if you pull it towards you a little bit from the base, and then we can hear you properly. Thank you. Much better.
Okay, so we had a look at the figures yesterday, and it seems to us that the pandemic has had a greater impact in London than it has in elsewhere in England. Largely because there's more private sector employers here, partly due to the visitor economy, greater levels of self-employment, probably some impacts coming from the pandemic and the changes to ways of working, so hybrid, people staying at home, so that kind of office-based economy being hit by that. And it's translated into higher unemployment. Now, there's been a trend over the years, really, that there's been lower employment in London generally, reflecting that a lot of people commute in, and there are lots of deprived areas too, and we know there's a bit of a debate around sort of how we level up in London. But generally, higher unemployment we're seeing here, which kind of reflects a demographic trend around a younger, more mobile population. In fact, economic inactivity fell in the first year of the pandemic when it rose elsewhere. However, the kind of trend has returned, really. And it seems to us, and looking at the data, that the recovery in London isn't emerging as strongly as it is elsewhere. So we are seeing that sort of slightly above England rate of unemployment, above England rate of inactivity, economic inactivity, and it just seems to have ticked up in the recent figures. So I think, and I've forgotten the starting point of the question, but I think there are some trends to really watch here and to think about.
Thank you very much. Naomi.
Great. So I would agree with a lot of what Becky has said in terms of the current trends that we're seeing in the labour market. If we look at the latest figures compared to pre-pandemic rates, we know that economic inactivity is still slightly higher than the pre-pandemic rates, particularly among men. So I think there's an interesting gender divide in terms of the employment recovery. We can also see that the employment recovery whilst the employment rate hasn't reached pre-pandemic levels, it has been fastest amongst 25 to 49-year-olds and slower among younger people and those over 50. So there are some demographic differences there. And we've also seen over time, over the kind of longer time, kind of fall in average real weekly pay as well, which has obviously had an impact in terms of how the cost of living crisis has been felt too. So those are the kind of headline trends.
Okay, thank you. Why does London have higher rates of unemployment and lower rates of employment than the national average? And Becky, I know you touched on that, but if you want to expand. So Naomi, if we can start with you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think obviously we saw during the pandemic that London's labour market was hit very hard, saw the fastest rise in the claimant count in 2020, and that was largely due to the impacts of lockdown on London's economy. It was also linked to the prevalence of kind of low pay and insecure work in London too. So we know that low-paid Londoners were hit hardest in terms of employment during the pandemic. So I think it's the kind of the impacts and the long-running impacts are in part due to the nature of London's economy and the kind of types of sector, and also kind of levels of inequality, which speaks to the points I was making around the kind of prevalence of low-paid and insecure work.
Okay, thank you. Becky?
Yes, I agree with Naomi on those points, and I suppose there is something around the kind of presence of jobs in London and the nature of those jobs. So kind of sectors hard hit by the pandemic are still sort of seeing recovery as hard. So hospitality, sort of tourism, travel, those kinds of things that are affecting employment. There are also fewer vacancies in London typically, which it's harder to establish quite right, but it may be about the lack of confidence amongst some employers that the economy is recovering, that they want to sort of hire into some of those jobs. What we're also seeing in terms of vacancies is a bit less in the way of full-time employment and sort of more kind of temporary and part-time employment, which may be indicating, again, a lack of confidence amongst London employers about quite how the recovery is going here.
Okay, and what lessons do you think can be learned from the pandemic in protecting London's labour market from future economic shocks? Becky, if you'd like to start.
I think trying to, I mean, it was such a big shock to any economy, and it hit sectors in different ways. So I think sort of trying to think about the sectoral perspectives and the ways this has affected work and what that means for London's economy, and around how work has reorganised. So some sectors have been able to recover because of the way work is done, and those people who were able to do hybrid work and sort of have desk jobs were less affected, although that has had an effect on the London economy because they may be at home more. I think trying to get people towards better quality work has to be the ambition. Better quality work leads to better health and well-being, leads to better economic security, and those wider determinants of a healthy, resilient population and economy, and that will actually meet some of the skills demand that we will see coming as the recovery does come to the surface.
Thank you. Naomi?
Great. Well, I guess, the pandemic was different from a lot of other economic shocks that we've seen and have impacted on London. But I think there are a few lessons. Clearly, the impact of the pandemic would have been far worse on London's labour market had it not been for the furlough scheme. So that we know that around 1.6 million jobs were furloughed in London. That scheme, that obviously national scheme, had an impact on protecting lots of jobs. But beyond that, I think it's looking at what further support can be put in place to help people stay in work during kind of economic downturns. And also supporting people back into work quickly if they do fall out of the labour market. And at the moment, I think the challenge is because of kind of increases in economic inactivity, and in London there are kind of lots of different reasons why people are economically inactive and not working, not seeking work. It's how you kind of make sure that employment programmes are able to reach those people who aren't necessarily eligible for some of the kind of bigger employment support schemes. So I think there's the support that was provided through things like the furlough scheme and employment support, but then I'd also say over the longer term it's continuing to work to improve job quality in London. We know, as I've said, that the impacts were felt hardest by those who are in low-paid jobs and insecure work. So it's continuing to look at all the ways in which we can improve the quality of work over the longer term for people in London.
Thank you. I have colleagues who'd like to come in on the back of those questions. Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you very much, Chair. On the potential shocks to the economy, Becky, I know that the Institute for Employment Studies actually two projects recently on artificial intelligence, and I was wondering whether any of the research that you've done has given you any insight or potential effects of the introduction of new technologies such as AI could have on London's economy, and anything that we've learnt from the pandemic and that shift of home working that we can perhaps prepare for.
Yes, as you say, we've done a fair bit around artificial intelligence. I am overall myself an optimist in terms of what it can achieve, although of course we need to be very aware of the dangers it brings and to think about how it can best be applied. I think what it does, and thinking about some wider work that we do, is it brings to the surface where we need human skills and where people are really important in the experience of life, and much of that will surround work, and where a kind of machine and a heuristic can sort of process things and do things in a way that is efficient and quick. And I think that gives opportunity for me to think about how we do things differently and how we move towards that better quality of work, where we really maximise the value of, human thought, human interaction, human emotion, and sort of put that kind of more routine nature of work aside and allow the machines to do it. It does change the nature of skills demand in the economy. We will talk about increasing need for digital skills, information technology skills, but also there are rising essential skills for employment around collaboration, communication, those very human elements, and I think we need to help people understand that they bring those to the economy, and help employers think about how they position people in the workplace and the potential of the machine, of the artificial intelligence.
there's still there's a feeling as if there's still a lot to learn and lots of, like, even the government needs to catch up on this, and there's a feeling of the threat of it threatening junior roles and young people and who are trying to get on the ladder, as it were. But do you think actually that we do need to be a lot faster with legislation, perhaps, or some sort of regulation? Is that something that your findings, found? Do you think we need to do more to safeguard jobs in London?
I think we need to be careful about how quickly we move into using AI in particular forms of that. I mean, I think we're seeing automation, and as I say, I think that does have a potential. We anticipated, I suppose, until quite recently that automation and machines would start to replace entry-level work and some of the more routine jobs. Now, I can understand what you're saying about the threats for any labour market entry, and I suppose those are often the jobs that we think people start in, but I suspect we'll be reframing that as, we're seeing rising demand for skills at higher levels. And I think, those human entry levels may change in the labour market, but we'll need to be thinking about that. As to regulation, I do have some concerns about the AI and some of this generative AI, and some of the tech bosses are talking a lot about that. I can't say I'm an expert, but I think we need to be aware of it and thinking about taking some time to really think about what it does and what it doesn't do. I suppose the ethics of it and where it's produced untrue information worries me. So we've talked about using it in social research and how it might generate a literature base, but you also might find it's generated a false piece of literature that doesn't actually exist. So I think we need to have great care around that. I'm not sure how easily regulation will be, because I'm not sure how easy it is for us to get on top of the technology. So I suppose the message is for employers not to just jump on to using it as the kind of saviour of all things, but to be very aware of how it can be deployed in the workplace, how you can monitor its effect, but also how you make best use of your human assets and get the benefit of people in the workplace.
I'll just wrap up with one last thing. Do you think the mayor needs to be more aware of the advancements that's going on and the rate that it is at the moment? Do you think that if you in terms of your projects, do you think that there's a real understanding from his perspective and even the government's perspective of all these challenges that you've just mentioned?
I wouldn't like to sort of comment specifically on the mayor or particular, the government. I think there is a weakness there. I don't think we're in advance of the technology. I think we are lagging, and we need to sort of take a bit of pause to really think about the potential. I think it's very easy to think about the benefits without recognising the potential consequences and downsides of the technology.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Bukhari. Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, panel. I'm sorry I'm not with you in person, but I'm actually at Newcastle at Northumbria University, where today we're launching some new research around universal basic income and health impacts. And that comes to my question, really, and my question is for Naomi. Naomi, you were talking about the furlough scheme and how important that was, particularly for London's recovery or during the pandemic. I'm wondering if you've done any research into universal basic income, and if you've got any reflections on what a more permanent furlough-like scheme would mean for avoiding precariousness within our economy.
So we haven't done any research looking at universal basic income specifically, but I am very aware of all of the debates around universal basic income and the principles behind it in terms of ensuring that there is an adequate kind of safety net and that people have a good level of income replacement that gives them some level of security and flexibility. I think it's difficult to see how it would work in in practice when you think about the costs involved, but I do think it links to the importance of making sure that there is adequate kind of safety nets for individuals, and that kind of links to the kind of welfare state and kind of benefits system. I think linked to that is ensuring that people know what benefits they are eligible for, and improving kind of their understanding of that. So I do think it's a really, making sure that that financial safety net is there and that it's adequate is really important in terms of limiting the kind of long-term labour market impacts, but also ensuring that people don't fall into poverty, don't fall deeper into poverty, and then kind of suffer the kind of wider kind of impacts of that.
Thank you, Naomi. If I can turn to Becky briefly, so just responding to that, I mean, I appreciate the cost question, but there's lots of research that shows it could actually be cost neutral depending on where you put the level at and what you do with the Department of Work and Pensions, but that's a conversation for another day. But if I come back to your artificial intelligence point, you talked about especially some jobs in certain sectors starting to disappear and become increasingly automated. Do you think it's important that we kind of future-proof or almost look at what could be a crisis coming down the road if more jobs increasingly are becoming automated?
I think, as I've been discussing, I think we need to think about the nature of the jobs that might disappear and the jobs that might grow. And I think the growth jobs are where, those human skills really apply, the kind of essential skills that we're looking for. And we need to see people developing around collaboration, critical thinking, communications. There are things that AI can't do as much as it can. And, it can, and automation can deal with those routine jobs. We're all aware of chatbots sort of taking you to a first level of customer service, but you still need, at a certain point, for a human being to really swing in and solve your problem when it becomes complex. So I think it needs some thought. It also needs work to protect the individual, to be able to make career transitions in the labour market. So we need to see much better progression in employment in the economy generally, and that would lead, or for me, that would involve much more training. So we wouldn't simply focus on the talent pipeline and what's going on in full-time education as people come through that, but we would be thinking about reskilling and retraining far more and trying to encourage much more of that and giving employers much more of a focus around what they could do and how they can retain and progress people in employment. We have very low rates of it and very low rates of training, and I think if we want people to be resilient in a world where artificial intelligence is, intrinsically now involved, we're not going to really change that. I think we need to make people resilient to it and carve out those areas of work where people really do make a difference, and that will have longer term benefits if that's the right quality of work, if routine work and basic work can be done using AI that actually would capitalise on the things that we really need a human perspective to be leading on.
Can I just check I understand your position in terms of you don't think there'll necessarily be unemployment because jobs will become increasingly automated and we won't need anyone to do those jobs, and those jobs that aren't automated yet, we need to grow those jobs in that sector. Do you not, it feels to me like there is, but I may have misunderstood, just a huge risk that actually those jobs don't grow and we just end up with lots of people unemployed.
I think, gosh, I don't know. I mean, the forecasts certainly don't take us fully in that direction. There are kind of, the pace of change isn't as rapid as that would indicate. I don't think we're sort of facing a cataclysmic kind of change. We still have a lot of jobs that aren't ready to change, aren't ready to automate, alongside those where we need to see greater growth around, for example, green skills. So I'm not as pessimistic as that. And there's something about technology adoption that also takes time, and the readiness of employers to invest, that I also think will avoid a cataclysm. But I do think we need to be readying ourselves for change, and readying people in work and people outside of the labour force currently to be prepared to be agile in a changing work context.
Thank you. I'm not there, but I know the chair wants me to move on, so thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Zach, and thank you for those answers. I have a question for you, Sam. It's well documented at the moment that there's been a rise in economic inactivity due to ill health, particularly among the older 50s. What do you think can be done to reverse this trend?
All that from the bottom. I think that's true. I think it's, however, we're seeing inactivity across different age populations. So I think there's an estimation of how ill health and long COVID have hit Londoners. I think if you look at the TUC report on long COVID, which came out last year, the figures are kind of, we think, much higher than are being reported in a lot of quarters, and the support hasn't been put in place for those people who've left the workforce for that during the pandemic. Obviously, we've seen kind of the impact generally on our health services, but people who had other long-term illnesses or impairments who essentially have dropped out of the labour market, and the support isn't there to get those people back into the labour market. So there's a big issue there around the kind of overall impacts at the moment of public health, of spending on the public health and social care sectors, and the sort of slightly hidden impact that's having on people's ability to go to work. There have been changes, we think lots of bits of our benefit system are not still not designed to support people back into work. So the impact of changes to UC, but also stuff around PIP and assessments and stuff, which again we've seen impacting negatively, and big figures in London. So a report which just came out this week actually from Equity, the union which covers people in the creative acting sector, kind of showing just how much the benefit system is not designed to support members in the creative industries in terms of getting to work. And some of those people had ill health over the period, but the way the system is set up is not designed, despite some of the rhetoric around it, to actually facilitate people being able to go back into the labour market, and facilitate people who might not be able to go back in full time but would be able to go back into jobs if there was more support. And we think the systems just aren't there in place. And then if we look at the under 50 kind of demographic, then as several colleagues on this panel have had good reports on, childcare costs in London, which are, as we know, 25% above what are already incredibly high costs everywhere in the country. But that really does have an impact on people's ability to enter the labour market. And we've seen over the pandemic people who left the labour market because they had to pick up childcare not being able to go back into work, partly because childcare costs have been so much, and that's had a particularly disproportionate impact on women and lone parents. So I think there's a kind of combination of factors that are driving that people being pushed out of the labour market and then not being facilitated to re-enter the labour market in a way which would suit them and their needs.
Thank you. And you touched on childcare there. You may be aware that this committee has just completed a very in-depth investigation into childcare and the effect on Londoners, both as purchasers and providers. And the report for that will be out in the autumn at some point. And you talked about benefits. Should the rate of statutory sick pay change now? And how is the statutory sick pay situation impacting the economic inactivity that we're talking about?
So 100%, we think the statutory sick pay system is is effectively broken. This was one of the issues which we raised throughout the pandemic. I'm saying countless committee meetings, but it was also being raised directly with the now Prime Minister when he was Chancellor. So during the very successful negotiations on the furlough scheme and the self-employed worker scheme, the other element of that which we really wanted to see was substantial changes to the sick pay system. One, because statutory sick pay is entirely inadequate. £93 a week is not enough for people to live on. But secondly, because, as we know, hundreds of thousands of Londoners, millions of people across the country aren't even eligible because they haven't got the type of work contracts which would enable them and to be able to show they've got the hours to even qualify for statutory. So on the one hand, that we think is problematic because it's been driving kind of inner health, but when it comes back to your previous question about how we might prepare the economy for future shocks, one of the things which we've consistently said and said right from the beginning of the pandemic, pre-pandemic, was that one of the problems was if you have a situation where people shouldn't be going into work because they might be contagious, might be passing something on, would cause longer periods of illness for more people, and those people are having to make a decision between putting food on the table or going into work where they might feel okay but know that they've tested positive for something which is contagious, then, in reality, people were going into work, and those were often people in public-facing roles. So there's a piece there around reforming it because it would just improve people's health opportunities, but also in terms of building resilience into the London and national economies, reforming the statutory sick pay system, bringing it up to a system much more like some of our European colleagues, where you have systems where statutory sick pay mirrors your existing pay, is paid from day one, doesn't have cut-off points, and all workers are eligible for it, would be an incredibly important part of building that resilience in.
Thank you very much. And you've highlighted a really serious issue during the pandemic about people going into work whilst they tested positive, because it was either they didn't eat or they went to work. And we have, some really awful stories from that time with regard to that particular issue. Thank you. Moving on to Assembly Member Garrett to ask the next question.
Hello, afternoon everyone. We've talked a bit about technology, things that might happen, so I'd like to talk a bit, if I may, about technology that definitely has happened, which is the sort of remote working, hybrid working, split week world that I suppose many of us now live in. So perhaps if I could start with you, Sam. So particularly thinking about from the point of view of employees, what's been the sort of impact on workers of that shift, which of course has been much more so in some sectors and obviously not at all in others?
It's still something, I think, which we're all very much kind of looking at the impact, and because the evidence is obviously developing all around us. So I think on the figures I was actually looking at on the Economic Data Store, the GLA's figures, I think something like 1 in 5 Londoners are now saying they have got some kind of flexible working. And obviously we've seen lots of people who are in office-based roles who are now doing that. At the TUC we now have a system which is technically called a 5-day fortnight, where we're entitled to work 5 days at home if we want to, and 5 days in the office. Actually, most of my team like coming into the office, so we're in there most of the time. But we're office-based, so we can do that. Obviously, lots of roles do not have the ability to work in that way at home for that length of time. So I think there's some really interesting things we're looking at there about a kind of reinforcement in some ways of a kind of class divide on flexible working, where if you're in a white-collar office job, finance sector, then yes, you can set up, if your business or employer will provide you with facilities to do that at home, you can do that. If you're working in a shop or you're a security guard or anything, then you're going to be going into work. And so there are issues there around what that means, which we're still looking at. We're still assessing kind of what that means. There are all sorts of equalities issues based around home working, all sorts of health and safety issues based around increased kind of working outside of workplace, where there might be risk assessments. There might be other stuff. Obviously, employers are supposed to do risk assessments if you are working at home. I think all the evidence is most employers don't at the moment have the capacity to risk assess people who are home working to see if they've got desks which are set up ergonomically. It comes back to the ill health issue, kind of impact on that. Issues around isolation, issues around people not having proper contact with line managers. Said we don't yet have. We've got some interesting kind of initial reports on this, but we don't yet have the data on how that's changing. But I think two of the things we're looking at, I said, particularly the kind of potential breakdown in terms of who has access to flexible working, who doesn't, and we're very much arguing that all workers should be able to request flexible working from day one, and that also involves looking at what that means for workers who are not necessarily office-based. So
it's tricky to do that if you're a bus driver, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. But there are ways of putting in systems for people. So if you're looking at how people like that do training, how they do career progression and stuff, there are ways of actually kind of making sure there are different ways of doing it, but that everyone can have access to that, and that's unions and employers working kind of together to look at what's possible there. But I say that kind of hidden issue around, we'd have colleagues in our Disabled Members Network who were kind of very positive about some of the aspects of home working in terms of disabled workers and access, but equally were very worried about the isolation, the fact that people didn't have access to adjustments at home that they might have if they're in the office. And so I think lots more work to kind of do on that. Lots more work to do on just how the return to kind of workplaces has actually been happening. If you look at the latest TfL statistics, I mean, they're surprisingly higher than I thought they'd be at this stage. If you look at kind of passenger use on TfL kind of networks, actually does seem to indicate that more people are going back into work more regularly, probably than I'd thought even 6 months ago.
Yeah, my train this morning would attest to that.
Even the Elizabeth line on the way over was packed.
Just on your point, actually, so one of the things that's interesting to me is about the difference between doing this for a short period and doing it over a longer period. Things like mentoring and progression. Obviously, you get this even if you don't have formal mentoring processes, one of the things that happens when you're a new person in an organisation is you get informal mentoring by seeing what other people do. I don't know whether I'll go along the panel in a moment. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on or any evidence on whether that is creating a problem.
So not yet. So I think colleagues may have kind of some more actual kind of empirical evidence. So we've got anecdotal evidence because we're looking at this certainly in our organisation in terms of how you provide that support. We've been going through programs of kind of literally kind of training for line managers on managing people who are working at home when we're not doing team meetings in person as regularly, but we're doing stuff. What are the implications? And so I think if you look across all sorts of London employers, private and public sector, who are now kind of looking at that, taking in kind of the evidence about what's actually been happening. But I say we're still all fairly new to that, and it's developing quite rapidly. But I think people are adjusting. Quite rapidly to that. I think there's quite a lot more kind of stuff at the moment on how you can support employees in different environments. And I say that point around who has access to flexible working, and in fact nearly everyone can have access to flexible working, but at the moment it tends to be quite segregated as to who actually gets that.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Naomi, what sort of same question, and again, the thought particularly I'm interested in this question about mentoring and progression and so on, if it becomes a long-term arrangement.
I think lots of us are still trying to understand the impacts of hybrid working, and there are lots of questions around how that's going to impact London's economy, and particularly kind of central London office economy. We know, I think, from Centre for Cities did a survey earlier this year which showed that central London office working was at around 59% of January 2020 levels. I think there are obvious kind of questions around that in terms of the impact on employees, but also on businesses, on productivity, and on particularly young people and their access to development opportunities. They're more likely than other workers to come into their office or place of work, I think in part because they don't have quite often suitable working space at home. But it does raise very real questions about access to those mentoring and development opportunities that often take place quite informally, kind of face to face. I think it's worthwhile thinking about how that fits with longer term trends in employer investment in skills, because we know employer investment in kind of skills and workforce development has been falling over the longer term. Employers in London are less likely to invest in training, and people with no or low qualifications and younger people are less likely to access job-related training. So I think you've got to put the kind of impacts of the kind of pandemic, moved towards kind of hybrid working in the context of those longer term trends and inequalities in access to training and development opportunities. And I think it's really something that we do need to look at in terms of young people's access to those opportunities. But I would also say that the kind of flexible working, because obviously hybrid working is one form of flexible working, and I think that relates to the kind of earlier questions around work and health and supporting people who are disabled and long-term sick back into the workplace. There's an opportunity there, but I think there's a lot more work to do with employers to ensure that they are able to access, to offer flexible opportunities and build and kind of develop inclusive workplaces.
So when you talk about that, you're now talking about flexibility. Let's say you're maybe 100% at work. Let's say you're a waiter, for example. Difficult to do that from home. When you're talking about flexibility there, you're talking about flexible hours, flexible
different forms of flexibility. So that could be to do with kind of location, remote working, but it could also be to do with your hours and kind of job role.
Understood. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that because I wasn't quite sure. Matthew, from a sort of employer's point of view, how's the work from home / hybrid revolution looking?
Yeah, again, it's very much sectoral based, but ultimately the small businesses we speak to are very much agile and flexible by their nature. You've got, from our stats, around over 90% who are offering at least one member of staff some form of flexible working. 55% offer home working compared to pre-pandemic, which is around 39%. So they have shifted and moved in that direction. The difficulty you have is that small businesses, the average size, 3-4 employees, you don't have a corporate structure, HR experts in your business, like say a Deloitte or a big four accounting firm. You don't have that necessarily. So you are going on instinct at time. You're going on kind of the fact that you're a flexible employer. You're working with your staff. You're listening to your staff. And we have to remember as well that a lot of businesses cry out for leadership, management help. They don't get that if you're a very small business. You can get that if you're a bigger business. And the mentoring aspect you were talking about, I think in this area in particular, to help those businesses with those skills in leadership, management, helping them would be extremely beneficial for them to kind of navigate how beneficial a flexible operation helps their bottom line. So I think that taking the round would work well.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Becky, and in particular, just if I can, you were talking earlier about London having not recovered from the pandemic as well, and from the figures I see, London has more hybrid flexible working. I don't know whether those just happen to correlate or whether they're some way connected.
Gosh, I hadn't thought about that, to be fair. I'm not sure I can answer that question, but I will answer sort of more generally in the kind of realms of the effects of hybrid working and the sort of disparities perhaps that have come through. And I do think, sort of when I started my research career, we were talking very much about how do we sort of mobilise and maintain a mixed stage workforce. How do we get the benefits of longer working lives? And of course, with this move to hybrid, there are disparities emerging where younger people are coming into the workplace for the reasons Naomi set out, and then many of our older workers, where they have that opportunity, stay at home. And I think there is a loss of that informal mentoring and that ability. It's that informal contact, whereas, if it's a Teams meeting, it's got to be 15 minutes to half an hour, and everything has to have a permission around it, and I don't think it's as supportive. So I think we need to do better. I think it is about trying to provide really good practice models of how to encourage people into the office and when to come into the office and what for. So for us privileged enough to be in those kind of jobs, to maximise those kind of social benefits of working while enabling, the benefits of home opportunities to also be there for people where they want to take that.
So just to bring up two things there. One, a couple of you have talked about younger people being more keen to come in. But actually I was speaking just before Christmas to an employer, one of the large sort of corporate type people. And actually, she was saying that it was the younger, new people, like new graduates in her team, that were most likely not to want to come near the office ever. So I'm wondering if there's hard evidence either about, you know, the sort of age, the break of age, whether it's different by different sectors, by different types. Because all of you have spoken about that as if it's a fact, and it does contradict what the person was telling me. So I wonder whether it's
I imagine, I mean, that's a really interesting one that I hadn't heard, but I imagine that does, that could be quite an issue. We do know that we've got rising levels of mental health and anxiety amongst young people coming out from the pandemic, and the effects for young people in London, will have, their lives were really disrupted from things they were doing to what they're doing now. And so entering the workplace sort of with those kind of levels of anxiety, probably the feelings of being at home, like much of your education, if you went to higher education, even if you were in post-16, actually if you're in school, a lot of it was disrupted, a lot of it you were sent home, and home wasn't an easy environment for everyone, but it became the environment, and I guess it's a hard habit to get out of. I think it would be really helpful to look into some of that. That's a good point.
Okay. And Alex, I suppose from the point of view of a large, let's call you the large corporate anyway, the large, well-organised employer.
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say before about hybrid, is I'm a sort of glass half full person generally on the opportunities of hybrid working for London, both from the point of view of the economy and from the point of view of the flexibility that it offers people, although I think there are very big challenges, and I think we've already heard earlier about the big hangover of sort of mental and physical outcomes from the pandemic, which I think is a big issue for London. But in terms of hybrid working, I mean, I'd say, we're sort of living it now at City Hall. It's been good. Manage a team of over 50 people. We're the work will still, the mayoral questions that you've all asked that we'll be answering this week will all be answered in a timely manner, as they always were. But people are able to work more flexibly. We have a lot of people with family or caring commitments, and they can now build their hours in a more flexible way. People really welcome that. Also, of course, given sort of cost of living issues, not necessarily pay, and although this brings issues for TfL, of course, but not needing to pay to get in every day, that's also something that people welcome. I wonder, by the way, whether that's also an issue with some young people not coming into the office, the expense of sort of travel. So I think it's good for people. For the economy, I mean, again, and there's been a lot of, and even in the last week or two, around, is the city empty? Is Canary Wharf emptying? But actually, the sort of office stats overall aren't that. I feel. I mean, it's perhaps a little bit early to see exactly where we're going, but where it feels like we're going to me is that sort of larger, poorer quality office space is being, I was just talking to Matthew about an example of this, is being replaced by smaller, higher quality office space in the city, in Canary Wharf and elsewhere. If the upshot of all of that is there's a surplus of office space that we can convert into residential and other things, then that might help London's huge sort of housing problem. So I don't feel there are necessarily huge issues there, although, of course, in the short term it means that some parts of London are going to be busier than other parts of London. But again, as is well documented, even where parts of central London may seem quieter, other parts are busier, and you're seeing the suburbs busier as well as people work flexibly. So the optimistic thing is there's a bit of a zero-sum game there in terms of things moving around London.
Just on, I don't know what you're seeing, sort of again from this sort of larger employer point of view. So this trade-off between the flexibility and the sort of home work balance that it enables. You can finish work and immediately be at home, ready to pick up the kids or take them somewhere lovely to the park, perhaps on a day like today. Versus the kind of loneliness and isolation that can kick in, where for lots of people that social contact that comes with workplace doesn't happen. I mean, I don't know how you approach that, how you try to sort of find your way through that balance.
Well, I mean, my observation so far.
I don't mean you personally, by the way. I meant you as
a collective. Well, I would say that collectively, what one is finding is that, and again, maybe this is a bit of a challenge when people say, well, everybody's going to come in, 2 days a week, or is that in reality there are people who, for personal reasons, may prefer to be in the office every day, and that may be to do with kind of inadequate things at home, or indeed just because it's a friendlier place to be. There may be people who, for whatever reason, prefer to be in the office less. Every individual is different. I guess collectively we're thinking, well, as long as people are achieving their objectives, I'm not sure it matters. The area that does trouble me a bit personally is the area that's just been touched on now around, well, what does it mean for people coming into the workplace? And again, I don't really know what the answer is, and you probably have to ask somebody 30 years younger than me, because I'm used to thinking in terms of, as are many of us, I guess, of the office. You go to school and then maybe you go to higher education and then you get a job and you go to the office every day, but that model may no longer apply. And what that means, I think we're still kind of trying to figure out.
Okay, so thank you very much. So, thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Garrett, I think Naomi wanted to come in. No, that's fine.
My apologies.
Just very quickly in reply to your question around younger workers, and my reference to younger workers coming into the office was based on the findings from the Centre for Cities study that I mentioned. So I think that report is available on their website. It obviously,
this is in relation to the question of whether younger people are more likely, less likely.
Are more likely to come into. So it's focused on the Central London office economy, but their survey found that younger people were more likely to come into the office.
Okay, that's very useful. Thanks, Naomi, and thank you, Chair, for spotting.
Thank you. And Assembly Member Bakari, I believe you had a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. On the issue of remote working, this is for Naomi, and perhaps Alex might want to come in as well. There has been a real rise of a variety of industries now that are working as digital nomads, so people working as abroad. Essentially. Now, Brexit has also meant that some working rights in the UK it's a lot harder for some EU citizens to get those working rights now, and London could potentially be missing out on a lot of talent, particularly maybe in the tech sector and for startups. What's your opinion about that, Naomi?
So, yes, I guess this relates to kind of broader debates around the kind of immigration system and the kind of impacts of Brexit. So we have seen some changes in terms of migration patterns, and we've seen more non-EU workers in the UK. So lots of employers are still accessing kind of international labour, just tends to be non-EU individuals. And actually, when you look at some of the latest employment figures, we can see that actually non-EU migrants are actually driving a lot of the employment recovery too. So we've definitely seen some changes in migration patterns, and it varies across kind of sector and will do from business to business. But international labour migrants still play a very important role in the economy and London's economy.
I mean, there's been some interesting progress in Spain and Portugal who've started remote working visas. Do you think that's something that we could do to attract maybe more younger talent here as well?
So I am not an expert on migration policy. I think it's always useful to look at what other countries are doing and to learn from other countries, particularly where the labour market is concerned. So there might well be interesting examples to look at.
And you were mentioning about younger people earlier and mental health that impacts recently as well. The Office of National Statistics have revealed that 2.5 million people are currently not working because of long-time sickness, as we've been discussing earlier. How would you rate the Mayor's performance in terms of improving mental health for young people? Have you looked into that at all?
So that's not something that we've looked into in particular, so I couldn't comment on that. I would say, though, that there's been a sharp increase in the kind of prevalence of mental ill health, both amongst people who are out of work, so that kind of economically inactive group that we've been talking about, but also a very significant increase in people who are in work too. I think it's important to understand the degree to which that's linked to people's experience of work. And young people would definitely be included in that. Our wider work has shown there's been some very significant increases in young people with mental health conditions, and for a large proportion of young people that acts as a barrier to finding work. So it's something that we absolutely need to be focusing on and thinking about when we're supporting and kind of designing employment kind of programs to support young people into work. We're thinking about how we can support young people with their mental health too.
Becky, you wanted to come in, and Becky, I wanted to ask you a question as well, whether you think something like a creation by the Mayor of a wellbeing commissioner, maybe in his team, to improve and dedicate a focus on young people and everyone's mental well-being in the capital. Is that something that could actually be a really positive effect and impact economic productivity?
I personally would say so. I think the Mayor's agenda to think about the wider determinants of health and well-being is very well placed. I was really privileged at the start, just at the turn of the pandemic, just before it starting, we were involved in a project looking into the kind of mental health supports that the Mayor was introducing into further education to support young people. And of course, the need for that became immediately to the surface, as it were. There was a lot of thinking around sort of how a lot of best practice could be shared, how we increase sort of mental health supports, knowing that the demands for the child and adolescent mental health support service was outstripping demand. So how you could put sort of mental first health aid support within sort of providers and build those scaffolds to the main system so that it would become more supportive. And of course, helping young people achieve better qualifications in education, in their post-compulsory education is one of those wider determinants. So I do think having a mental health champion would be highly valuable. Brilliant. I think it would sort of help bring together this strand of work. I think there's also something based on some recent survey work we've done around young people's experience of mental health once they're in employment. And there's a real dissonance between employers' understanding of their mental health and actually young people's feelings and their wants in terms of support and the kinds of things that maybe are less good for their mental health, and actually what they do need in, and a lot of that does surround the quality of work and the quality of mentoring support that they can access. And obviously things like employee assistant programs are brilliant, but actually it was about that connection in the workplace. So I think a champion to help spread. Brilliant.
Well, I'm glad that you support that idea. I mean, Alex, what do you think? A wellbeing commissioner, a mental health champion? It's a good idea.
I'm going to, as you'll appreciate, sort of Macquarie, not my policy area, and colleagues in communities and social policy will doubtless have you. It definitely sounds like an idea that's worth exploring some more. I mean, I wondered if I could just come back. You mentioned digital nomads at the beginning, and I guess as you said that, I think generally the idea of digital nomads, isn't it, is they go to places that where that are sort of very sunny and have a cheaper cost of living. And while London is the greatest city on earth, I'm not sure it scores highest in either of those categories. Well, it's quite nice at the moment. So on a more serious note, of course, where the Mayor does have some strong views. Is around how migration, how immigration is being managed. You'll be aware that he's called for devolution to have a sort of regional shortage occupation list, so that we can look in the capital where there are labour market shortages and how we might do them. He's called for that to be devolved to City Hall. I don't think we pretend to be the experts in this area. The government has a migration advisory committee. They've been providing advice to the government. I think the government has been ignoring some of that advice. The Mayor's position is he would accept that advice. You know, if we're saying there are shortages in, you know, construction, hospitality are two areas, social care, that have been mentioned. So I think, you know, this is not an area, you know, we recognise this is an area where we need to see significant changes. I'm not sure we're saying we've got all the answers, but we know that the current system is not working very effectively.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions that are aimed to yourself, Sam, but if anyone else does have any views, then I'm sure we'd be welcome, very, very welcome. And it's about the quality of employment in London and how that's changed since the pandemic. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts on that, particularly in relation to insecure work and 0 hours contracts.
Thanks. I think this was covered kind of initially by a couple of colleagues on the panel in their interventions, but what we've continued to see, and it was happening before the pandemic, but the pandemic has probably enhanced it in some areas, is unfortunately a mushrooming in various forms of insecure work. So when we say insecure work, we would define that as people on 0 hours, which has shot up nationally, but has seen an even higher increase in London. People on short hours contracts as well, which covers an even larger number of people, but is equally worrying and damaging. And people in bogus self-employment, so not genuine self-employment, which could be an incredibly important part of the economy, but people who are classified as being self-employed when very clearly they're not, but it's being done so they don't get access to various rights, benefits and employment protection. So we've seen kind of, you know, I was listening to something on the radio the other day which explained what exponential actually meant. So I was almost going to say exponential. It's not an exponential rise, but we've seen a scary rise, and an increase in that insecure work. And in key sectors, I mean, often in the sectors where we're also, no coincidence, facing some of the biggest labour market shortages. So if we look at the areas where we think there are the biggest decent work deficits in London, they are, no surprise, some of the ones which have got the worst conditions, the lowest pay rates, the lack of progression in jobs. So if we look at large parts of the hospitality sector, if we look at social care, if we look at a lot of kind of the business support roles, so outsourced roles often in terms of cleaning, security, facilities kind of stuff, you know, areas which employ hundreds of thousands of Londoners, but where we've seen, as I said, an intensification of poor working conditions and business models which are in the long term, as the pandemic has shown and the labour market shortages in some areas have shown, are not actually sustainable business models. I mean, you know, this is not good for the long-term economy. It's not good for employers who are trying to do the right thing, for Londoners who are trying to work in those jobs, or for our economy overall. Just because I was missing lots of points on, so want to come in on some of those other points, but I mean, just to link it back to mental health points that you were just raising as well, Assembly Member Bukhari. But yeah, if you look at the mental health pressures on people in insecure work and what that is doing to people, it is very clear. If you then connect that with the absolute cuts to our mental health preventative services kind of in the capital and see what's happening, it then reinforces for people being out of the labour market, because instead of being out for a short period of time, being able to get support, being able to get back into the labour market, they are having incredibly difficult conditions, and insecure work is a large part of that. The point was made earlier on around, although we've seen some statistics on kind of pay increases, actually, if you look at it overall, since the economic crisis 2007-2008, we are still have seen a massive net reduction in real terms wages when inflation's taken track, even before this latest kind of massive spike in inflation. So you're seeing jobs which are not paying, you're seeing more people than ever before who are in households below the poverty line but have at least one adult who is working, but work isn't paying. You're seeing more people working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, to try and make ends meet, claiming universal credit and working, but the system's kind of really not delivering for people. Yeah, we've just done. Sorry, Chair. I know we're supposed to be short answers, but we've just had our disabled members conference, national conference down in Bournemouth. We did a lot of analysis in the run-up to that on the disabled pay gap, which is again huge nationally. London actually has a slightly smaller pay gap for disabled workers than outside London, but it's still very significant. And if you kind of look at the quality of work that too many of our citizens are being confronted with, it's bad, and the pandemic has effectively reinforced trends which we were seeing pre-pandemic.
Yeah. So when you're talking about sort of the quality of work, the impact on people of precarious work, insecure work, 0 hours. You talked about low pay, you talked about health outcomes. Is there anything else that sort of arises out of that in terms of, I mean, they're pretty big, those two.
No, so it impacts on everything, because,
Yeah.
I mean, again, coming back to the training and skills point, which I think there may be more questions on coming up. If you're in insecure work, you are far less likely to be accessing any kind of training or progression, because the employers who are following that type of business model are not going to be the employers who are providing training or support to train, or the ability to actually kind of go and do that. Again, on childcare issues, as we've seen, you know, if you are in those forms of insecure work where you just don't know what your shift pattern is going to be the following week, you can't organise your childcare, therefore you can't go into work. I think this came up. I think my colleague Vic, who was speaking to you on the last investigation that you referred to, Chair, around childcare, talking to you about some of this before she came to talk to you at that stage. But, you know, the knock-on impacts of said hundreds of thousands of workers in those conditions on all aspects of life and work. We're seeing it now again with a housing kind of situation. But if you're in insecure work, it's much harder to provide a landlord if you're in rented accommodation with proof of your income. We're seeing more evictions for people who are in that kind of situation. If you've got a mortgage and your interest rates are going up and you can't show that you can actually meet that, you're far more likely to be evicted or kind of lose. So, I mean, so the knock-on impact of on every aspect of people's lives from that mushrooming of insecure work is savage. And we obviously talk to people day in, day out in this situation. We were doing lots of meetings during the pandemic where we were taking key workers, public and private sector, in to see MPs cross-party, mostly online, to talk about what their experiences were. And it was amazing to me that we were sitting with MPs, sitting online with MPs who just had no concept of what their constituents are actually facing out on the ground. When MPs came, but surely you're entitled to statutory sick pay. Care workers going, no, we're not, because our employment status is such that we don't qualify for that. And it was kind of like, and I have to admit, I assumed some of these MPs would know that, but just didn't care. And actually what was coming out from these meetings was they just had no idea what conditions were actually like out there on the ground for so many people, because they hadn't met people that were in these type of employment relations. It just wasn't in their kind of experience. They might have potentially knocked on their doors during a campaign. But it's why it's so important that, and I hate the phrase lived experience, because what is not lived experience is zombies. But I know that lots of our colleagues here are doing lots more work on making sure that that genuine experience of people is being put forward to policymakers. And it is, you know, it shouldn't be shocking, but it's shocking to see how few people in positions making policy have actually got any experience of what that's like.
That's
Sorry, Chair.
No, that's much appreciated, because I think it's, you know, I think it is important, because we sort of talk about insecure work and it's like it is bad, but I think it's really important to remind ourselves why it is bad. So thank you for indulging me there. Can I just ask what and Sam or anyone else on the panel, what's the driver for the increase in insecure work in 0 hours since the start of the pandemic? It's in London specifically, given it's gone up so much more. What's going on?
So can I go first? Come back to
absolutely.
So I said I think some of it is the nature of, I said, business models which predated the pandemic, definitely. But you're seeing more. Drivers of, we were doing this work in terms of the London Living Wage campaign at the moment, which the Mayor is one of the co-chairs of, which is being supported by the Living Wage Foundation and citizens, and they have a hospitality sector working group. Lots of employers who want to make a change and see a difference, other colleagues and kind of partners, some unions. And that was fascinating, because you were sitting there, and they came back at the last meeting. I don't think this was an incompetent thing. Said, "This is, we've been talking to all these employers, and we're really surprised because none of them want to sign up to the London Living Wage." It was like, well, no, what a surprise, because these are models which are based on bringing people in, paying them at or in some cases below minimum wage, not progressing kind of staff, and that was what the business kind of model was predicated on, maximising profit they could get out of it, sometimes overseas private equity owned kind of stuff. So it was that type of business arrangement, and it worked while you had a pool of employees who were willing to take those conditions and then move to another bad job if they couldn't do it. The pandemic has impacted on that, because profits have fallen in some of those sectors, not in all, so they were kind of driving it down, and because there has been a reduced pool of people who were willing to take those jobs for that money. And they have been trying to fill some of those gaps by by some other ways of kind of getting people in, but it hasn't been working. But the lack of sustainability in that system is kind of being shown. But they were business models, some of the gig economy kind of stuff again, which was predicated on a profit margin, which was based on making sure that your workers did not have employment status but were on a various platform kind of stuff, and that therefore you would take the money and that would accrue to your shareholders in, I generalise slightly here, but California, if you're some of those big firms. So because there was no interest in them actually investing in the long term in the market.
I might be missing something here. So have the sectors that work like that expanded, or has more work become casualised and made insecure?
I think a little bit of both. We're seeing more sectors becoming casualised and insecure. So the spread of casualisation, and I admit I didn't realise this until I started looking at the figures, and this was partly pre-pandemic, it's been driven. But if you look at the second highest rate of insecure work of any sector is in education, which I hadn't realised. And so if you look at kind of what's happening in our education sector in terms of FE, HE, some schools as well in kind of academised systems, of teachers, lecturers on short-term contracts, on short hours contracts and stuff. And that again has exploded in the last couple of years. It's being driven, slightly anecdotal here, but talking to colleagues in the UCU, which is our main union in that sector, that's been driven by some of the kind of move to more online teaching. But it's not just that. It's kind of these are often kind of, this was often an experience which was happening pre-pandemic as well. And then you've had an intensification in other areas of, to come on to this in terms of kind of outsourcing of support functions, which was again happening before the pandemic, often in very insecure work, but has been kind of almost has continued during and as we come out of the pandemic. People trying to fill posts and bringing people in could well be a factor around people being worried about future stability and saying we don't know if we can employ people full time, so we're going to outsource some of this stuff so we don't have to take on the kind of additional support. But I think I said some of that was, well, a lot of that was happening anyway. Yeah. So that was something we were seeing in those sectors but it's been before the pandemic. The pandemic may well have exacerbated that.
That's fine, thanks. Matthew, did you?
Yeah, thanks. I think from our members' perspective, that the businesses we speak to anecdotally, but also survey, they want to, and they're doing all they can to pay all their staff above the London living wage. I think when we ask, I've spoken to various, and on the accreditation side, that their line to me is that I'd love to. I don't want to be accredited because during a cost of doing business crisis, what if next year things go awry and I suddenly can't have to drop just under the London living wage, or something goes wrong in the business, and there's that fear that while we're in this situation that they don't want to be, and it has a lasting impact on them. If suddenly you're a living wage accredited business and then you suddenly alarm bells start ringing, that has a knock-on effect on your reputation. So I'd say, and a lot of businesses we speak to, for instance, are paying themselves less than a minimum wage. And so I think whilst, Sam makes, the valid point, there is that element that to a lot of small businesses who are doing all they can to raise their level at this, the rents, the rates, the high costs of doing business, the energy costs, it's all these add on to the incremental aspect of difficulties of being able to do business. And I think that has to be seen in the round.
No, I think that's worth saying, and obviously, much more vulnerable to economic shocks, smaller businesses, your members. And just finally, back to Sam again. How do you think this rise in insecure work, the turbocharging in London, can be addressed? And what role does sort of the expansion of trade union recognition and collective bargaining, so sort of tackling that job by job as unions do, what role can that play in it?
And that is the $1 million question. So I would agree with Matt's point. I think in terms of kind of for employers I was talking about there, kind of tended to be some of the bigger employers, big hotel groups and restaurant groups who could do this but are choosing not to. I think there's a genuine point around how we support smaller businesses to actually kind of be able to do this. And it's a point we might come on to. So just in terms of where we go, I mean, some of this is obviously beyond the gift of devolved government. Well, lots of this is beyond the gift of devolved government in London, but there's a lot we can do in London. So obviously, as we approach the next general election, we are talking to all the political parties around kind of what manifesto commitments would be to legislation which would do things like ban 0 hours or ban imposed 0 hours contracts, bring in things like sector fair wage agreements, which we think initially could certainly be brought in the social care sector, where you would get social care employers unions and other interested parties around the table to look at essentially how you could get pay moving up to closer to a £15 minimum, productivity up, and other issues. So you look at the skills piece, productivity piece, and the wages piece, sector by sector, in key areas. That is national kind of level, but legislation could be brought in. At a London level, we think there's an awful lot more we could do to support workers' voice, workers' organisation. The procurement power of City Hall and local authorities is huge. The procurement codes already for the GLA family, so not just core GLA, but Transport for London, Met, Fire kind of services stuff, has some very good text in there around kind of fair employment and conditions, but actually seeing how that is delivered in practice and goes down the supply chains with people who the GLA is contracting to is something which we think needs more work, more support, but we think there's some positive stuff going on there. The London Good Work Standard has got some decent text on union recognition and workforce engagement. It's kind of slightly buried in the wellbeing piece, which I think was a mistake, but it's there. It's there at a stage. It's Good Work Standard is staged for different levels of kind of businesses to take people on that kind of process. We think there is more work which we want to work with GLA on to actually kind of deliver some of that stuff, and we think there's some mapping of good practice at a borough level which could happen. So if you look at what some local authorities in London have done with their procurement, but also with things like encouraging living wage zones, but also encouraging people to join unions during the pandemic as a way of staying safe. Islington, Southwark, number of councils were actually able to do quite a lot of that work, and it's really good. And there doesn't seem to have been, we've been talking to colleagues about this across different bodies, enough mapping of where that has happened. And we think actually kind of looking at good practice across the political spectrum, but working with London councils and the GLA, we think this is some of the work which the London Partnership Board, which I do sit on, but other colleagues are engaged with, sort of thing that could be done there as part of a kind of London Fairer City kind of work. So some really good initiatives, but need to be kind of developed and pushed home. And a lot of that, you would expect me to say from a union perspective, is about workers' voice and making sure that's heard, because we do think worker organisation is one of the most sustainable ways of delivering that in the long term. So you've got legislative change, but then you've got how do you actually enable people to understand what their rights are and not. And I'll finish on this, Chair, sorry. This problem we found certainly with doing work with younger workers in London, which is this problem that for a lot of people it's kind of become internalised, that poor standards they kind of see as the norm. And so you talk to people and they say, well, yeah, it's really bad, I'm being treated badly, but what I'm going to do is move to another not very good job, as opposed to actually, no, this shouldn't be the way this is. I'm going to work with my colleagues and try to get my employer to change this and make it better. And as I said, we found that's a real barrier we've got to get over, but we think there's some positive changes there.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Polanski, I've got you for a supplementary, but I wonder if you could make it very quick, please.
They're two, but they're both very brief, so I'll be very brief. Sam, first of all, thank you for everything you've done to amplify the voices of people with lived experience during this conversation. Along that lines, I've been doing lots of work with United Voices of the World UVW Union of Low-Paid Migrant Workers. It's really clear that a lot of these people are in 0 hours or precarious jobs, and sometimes there's a worrying correlation between precarious work and precarious migration, and the government using precarious work to crack down on that. Are you aware of any work, or what work needs to be done more to protect people, particularly from minority communities, but also our migrant workers?
Thanks, Annette. It's a really, really important question. So there is a lot going on across TUC-affiliated unions like UV, who are outside of that, but are doing some really important work. I was with some colleagues in a Spanish-speaking session on Saturday, actually at a church in the city, talking to exactly migrant workers, cleaning workers on this. So there, again, critical point here is a firewall between immigration services and your ability to actually assert your rights, your health and safety protections and stuff. So and I saw this 25 years ago when I was a union organiser for GMB, that legally people could assert their rights, employment rights or their rights under health and safety if they had an accident, but if they were worried about their immigration status, we would have to tell people not to put their heads above a parapet at that stage, because we knew that what might well happen is that it would then get taken on by that. So there's certainly stuff in TUC submissions to government and to other parties at the moment. So we come up to manifesto process around a firewall between employment rights and migration status stuff. There's then a whole nother issue around safe routes to work, around the fact that we think there should be paths to work for people who are, for instance, claiming asylum, but are here, but are legally obviously not entitled to work or recourse. We think that's a mistake. It comes down to some of the skills shortage stuff and needs to be done. We think there's some really important work, again, just in terms of wider support for people who are coming from other countries in terms of language and rights support. So it used to be the case that if you came from any EU country or any of the EU accession countries, you would get a leaflet, which we, TUC, did, along with, I think it was the Home Office at that stage, which set out your basic employment rights, which said you're entitled to a minimum wage, you're entitled to holiday. This is where you can contact what was then the Gang Masters Agency or other sources for support. That was curtailed when there was a change of government, so that no longer happens. We would like to see a return to that. We would like to see more work and support for things like English as a second language, which again in London, because we've got the devolved out education budget, that support is there, and organisations like UV who've been doing some great work in terms of kind of making sure that work organisation is also coupled to language skills and learning, and our unions like Unison and GMB are doing the same type of work. So a real kind of, huge amount of work going on stuff like that, but it's going to be getting even more important. Sorry, Chair, again, it comes back to his point on increased migration from outside of the EU. So this social care, I was just talking to a Unison colleague the other day who was pointing out that although the social care vacancies have fallen by about 20,000 in the last 6 months, so from about 170,000 to about 152,000, there have been 70,000 more workers have come internationally in the last 6 months. So A, if you take them out, the vacancy rate in fact hasn't fallen. B, a lot of those workers are going into very exposed, so they're absolutely here legally, they're here on visas which enable them to work in those sectors, but they are even more exposed to poor working conditions than other workers, and we have to make sure they've got access to the information about what they're entitled to, and things like the employment the rights hub here at the GLA and things that different boroughs are doing, the Newham rights hub and stuff. A lot more support we think could be given there.
Well said, there was a lot there. And just finally, today the government have awarded the public sector so-called pay rises, although you've already outlined why that's not true. And also they've said that money needs to come from departments. So this is a little bit like taking money away from Peter to give it to Paul. Is this enough for London's public sector workers? And if not, what would you like to see the Mayor doing or saying? Obviously, it's not on him, but he does have that convening and leadership power.
So I think it's that convening and leadership power and the Mayor and the Assembly to kind of talk about that. So we are pleased that those increases have been given. We are incredibly worried that no additional funding is being made because, as you say, it's going to be, if you're trying to fund those, I mean, just talking to head teachers or any of our kind of health service kind of leaders at the moment about where that money is coming from. I was talking to colleagues in the FBU, Firefighters Union, yesterday around the increase which they did secure. They balloted for our action, didn't have to take the action. But again, that's supposed to be coming from the Fire Brigade's existing budget, and it's just not going to be possible without cuts to those services, and no one who works in those services wants to see that because they're already under massive pressure. I mean, a lot of the industrial action that's been happening has not just been because wages have fallen back so poorly, it's because people are looking at the services they're trying to deliver and saying we cannot deliver services to anything like the standard which we as professionals want to, and it goes across all different services. So that is going to be a massive ongoing issue. We would like to see the Mayor and the Assembly continue, and other local authority leaders in London continuing to speak out about that. There is a huge case about fair funding for London. It's a whole separate issue, probably a separate inquiry, but making sure that London secures its fair share of the national pot, but then making sure that's allocated fairly within the capital as well. And I could go on about that for ages, but Marina will start throwing things at me.
I have a handy gavel here. Thank you very much. We are a little bit behind, but just before we break for our comfort break, Sam, I just want to thank you for highlighting what the event that you had in Parliament and the salutary lesson I think that all politicians need to take on board, which is that we should never assume and that we should always go and find out about the constituents and the people that we're meant to advocate on behalf of and what it is that they're actually going through, particularly in this awful cost cost of living crisis. Thank you, and if we could all come back here within 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
we're missing a piece of map.
I think Jack's going to find it.
Okay, thank you and welcome back to the second part of our session today. So questions now will be on vacancies, skill gaps and the challenges faced by businesses. And colleagues, we do need to pick up the pace. We are a little bit behind. So Assembly Member Boff, over to you.
Thank you. Just to finish off on the previous session, Mr. Jaffa, what would the effect, do you think, be if 0 hours contracts were abolished? What effect would that have on small employers?
I think it comes from the starting point that when you ask our membership, the majority, and I'm talking high 80s, 90%, would not be using 0 hours contract, but in some instances, it's where it's deemed that the statutory obligations have been met and there's employer and employee agreements, they have worked. But I'd say that the majority of cases doesn't. But I'm not, not getting drawn on the actual aspect of the abolition. And probably is not one for us to answer at this time.
But would you say some of those employees appreciate the flexibility that 0 hours contracts present?
We're talking from our kind of research and our kind of understanding and speaking to employers and employees, it has worked. But this, of course, is in the minority of cases, not the majority.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So it does produce a service for those people who otherwise might not be able to find employment. What are the, so if we move on to skills, what are the main reasons for the high vacancy levels in the UK compared to pre-pandemic levels? And how do the vacancy levels in London compare to the rest of the country? Start with you, Mr. Jaffa.
I'd say it's that kind of two-pronged economy that you've got, as I say, the one side of the economy where like professional services kind of that rely on that, they can work from home. They didn't suffer as much as those sectors that missed out hugely during the pandemic, and those in the hospitality, the leisure, the tourism sectors, those are the sectors that have really been impacted, and they are the ones who are struggling to recruit staff more than in other sectors, and we hear that regularly. We're seeing, the vast swathes of restaurants going under, or pubs that are struggling as a result of the cost of doing business crisis. But it's finding those skills, and it's mid-management skills, but it's low-level skills as well that they are struggling with, and it's a result of knock-on impacts of Brexit and the pandemic that it's a struggle and a real challenge. But I'd say it's probably more heightened in London because we have that huge amount of hospitality-focused industries, and it is a big, vibrant part of our economy. So, we need to do more in this particular area to boost skills and making it easier for small businesses to attract talent, not just from the non-EU countries, EU countries, but also our homegrown talent as well is critical. So, removing barriers, making it easier to take on apprentices. Apprentice numbers have dropped quite considerably in London. So those are the areas in particular we need to focus on.
Thank you. Ms. Newton, earlier you gave us, you said, it stuck in my head, and I don't want to misquote you, so I'd ask you to say it again. You were saying that actually the vacancy, I think you were referring to the vacancy rate and the employment rate. You're saying even though we've always had that high rate compared to the average in the UK, that actually it's getting worse in London in terms of vacancies and employment. Is that correct? I don't want to misquote you.
The latest figures show an uptick in the rate of unemployment and inactivity in London, so that suggests a trend that we wouldn't choose to see. And then I was exploring various reports on vacancies, and generally they're lower in London than elsewhere. But also there's a gap in terms of full-time vacancies. So
yeah, I know there's a historical trend, and we're aware of that. But the inference I took was that actually we're not just following that trend, it's getting a little bit worse for London compared to the rest of the country.
It seemed to us, but that is on the latest data, and I think it's a trend we need to keep looking at. You'd want to reverse it. I mean, thinking about why we might see the rise in vacancies, I mean, there is the exit from the labour market, and we don't particularly take the narrative of the great retirement. We're more concerned that people have left because of ill health issues and haven't been able to return. I know when we went into the pandemic and I was doing research on individual placement and support, and there was a lot of talk around actually employers were sort of a bit more flexible in how they'd support people and had different ideas and were more open to supporting people with health impairments back into the workplace. But I'm not sure how far that actually did materialise, and with the health service also struggling to get people back to full health, I think it is a major issue in our economy.
Yeah, I mean, we're interested on this committee of there's disparity between London and the rest of the country for obvious reasons. You know, our mandate is London. So we want to see where, you chisel out what the mayor's performance has achieved post-pandemic. And perhaps, Ms Clayton, you might be able to comment on that and why London appears so much worse than the rest of the country.
I wouldn't say it necessarily appears a lot worse than the rest of the country. I think other parts of the UK have seen much higher increases in economic inactivity rates, for instance. I think when we look at the vacancy rates, I think the latest data indicates that vacancies have fallen below where they were kind of previously at the start of the pandemic in London, where they kind of stay quite elevated in other parts of the country. Having said that, I think around 2/3 of businesses that have open vacancies in London are struggling to fill those positions. Nationally, part of the story is that, you know, compared to pre-pandemic trends, we've got 1 million fewer workers in the labour market than there would have been if pre-pandemic trends had continued. So part of the difficulty in filling vacancies and businesses finding the kind of staff and the skills that they need is because a lot of people have dropped out of the labour market. I think in London it's worth thinking about the fact that whilst nationally a lot of that has been driven by ill health, in London I think you see probably a wider diversity of reasons why people have left the labour market in the first place. And among those who are economically inactive, who want to work, there's a higher proportion who say they're economically inactive due to caring responsibilities. So I think we need to look at the kind of range of barriers that different individuals might face to enable them to access kind of jobs in the labour market, and for businesses to access the people and the skills that they need.
The data you use in your institute, you do break it down so that London, you can see the London stats, can't you?
Yes, we do where we possibly can, yes.
And I wondered which economic sectors in London are experiencing particularly high vacancy levels?
So, I don't know. So I've looked at the overall levels, so I can't answer specifically on specific sectors. I don't know if any of the other panellists can.
Mr. Jaffa, to you.
Just
Mr. Conway.
From memory, I think it's construction, hospitality and social care are three that come up a lot.
And have we got reasons for, do we know the reasons for that?
I mean, they're all, well, again, there's a cocktail of mixtures, you know, to do with the pandemic, Brexit, changes in migration. I mean, those were certainly three areas where a lot of EU workers previously worked, and we're now seeing a big uptick in non-EU workers in those areas. But I think, again, it's all sort of happening in real time. I think it's a little bit perhaps hard to draw any firm conclusions at this time. Sorry, Sam, I can see.
Sam.
Absolutely concur that those are the three sectors where we think, well, we're seeing from talking to colleagues for kind of the biggest vacancies, and there is definitely an issue there around EU colleagues from the rest of Europe who were coming in working in all three of those sectors, who are now coming obviously less because of Brexit, but also because economic conditions in London mean that if you could travel from Poland, you might go to Germany to work instead, even if we were still in the EU. But as well as that, those were also the sectors that I was referring to earlier on, which had historically some of the worst working conditions, and where people have been able to find other jobs. They have moved into other jobs with slightly better pay and better conditions, and they are moved away from some of those areas which had the worst conditions. So there is a point there, and when we talk to employers kind of in those sectors who are looking to how they kind of improve, they absolutely recognise that. They're looking at how you can provide proper career pathways, they're looking at how you can try to change that. But if you take, and it comes back to the kind of years of historic underspending on skills and development, that construction in the 1970s, all of our major UK construction companies ran training academies, and they trained their own people, and they had proper apprenticeship schemes, and then they stopped doing that, and they all closed their apprenticeships, and they all took people from different places who had those skills, and those people now aren't coming here, and there is going to be a lag while we try to develop people to fill those gaps. And so you need migration, and you need to be skilling up people who are here already, but it takes time and investment, and we're not seeing that across all of those sectors yet. The last point I'd make on that is, I think, as Naomi said, I mean, it's the same in those sectors across the country. I was talking to a Scottish TUC General Secretary the other day. Agriculture and hospitality, massive vacancies. We have a particular problem in London because of housing costs, as you all know. And housing costs, again, if you're on poor pay, make it very difficult. And previously, if you'd been coming from other parts of the country, moving down here to work in a pub or a bar, you would have got accommodation. Now lots of those people are choosing not to come to London, and I haven't seen, Alex may have the latest figures on population in London. I mean, we lost large numbers during the pandemic, and it seemed to be bouncing back, but I haven't seen the latest figures on overall population. But it would anecdotally, I think there are people who are not moving to London from the rest of the UK who would have fulfilled some of those posts because they can't afford to live anywhere near their jobs.
Well, I might be an outlier in my party, but we should never have got rid of freedom of movement there. I'm suddenly deselected. Look at that.
Assembly Member Boff, I think Matthew just wanted to come in.
Yeah, it was just quickly the point on immigration fees that majority of small businesses have never ever experienced the visa system and how to go through the immigration system, and that's a challenge in itself. So we kind of argue that no small business should have to pay more than about £1,000 in immigration fees, because that's just a stumbling block for them to do it. So 48% of our members say that the kind of lower fees would help them in this area take on people from abroad. So I think that's one of the major challenges on the visa side.
And with regard to, finally, very quickly, in terms of the actual sector size, not just in employment terms, but the sector size, have you seen any, what are the which have had a big increase and which have had a big decrease in terms of the sectors? Anyone? Go on. We've all got numbers. Come on.
I think so this is not necessarily focusing on specific kind of industrial kind of classifications, but I think it's worth noting the growth in demand for green jobs and skills. So estimates show that you've got a large concentration of new kind of green jobs in London and the South East. And you see that's a particular concentration compared to other parts of the UK, which is a very kind of positive kind of growth story. But many of those employers, we ran a survey with them, are struggling again to recruit the skills that they need, and struggling to recruit staff with the skills that they need, which is having an impact on their businesses, their ability to compete, their ability to kind of keep up with changes in technology. So I think that's an area of focus here when we're thinking about the kind of changing London labour market and kind of growth in green jobs, demand for green skills, and the extent to which employers are able to meet those demands. It's an area where we know lots of young people are inspired to pursue careers in the green economy that support the transition to net zero, but lots of young people don't necessarily know what those career opportunities look like, where they might access those kind of training opportunities too. So I'm finishing now, but
we've kind of established that in London it's a little worse than anywhere else. So what advice would you have for the mayor for us to catch up with the average? Anyone? Apart from Mr. Conway, he's paid to have a view.
I'm going to go with a training solution, but not just sort of thinking about the talent pipeline with young people in education coming through, but thinking about the workforce we've already got in place, and maximising the benefits of flexible contracts, but actually sort of training people for the changing jobs in our economy. I mean, if you're looking at the green labour market, the demand is for skilled level work, professional level work. If we want people to fill those jobs, we need to be training those people already in work and helping their transitions. And I think part of that is maximising the use of the infrastructure that exists. The LSIPs are one, thinking about using what they called local skills infrastructure partnerships. You've got the local enterprise partnerships. You've got a very complex world of different initiatives, and I think what you need in boroughs and in local authorities and in those kind of local authority groupings is some central support there to help people and employers navigate the skills, training and employment offer. I think it'd be really advantageous to bring together areas of careers advice so people can know, how to position training, development, maybe their applications to re-enter the labour market to some of these growth sectors, to some of these better quality jobs, but also get to understand what funding is available to support them, what courses are available there, and actually for employers, if they can grab some different talent into their workforces rather than thinking you have to buy in everybody who's qualified, which I think is a change in thought, actually how you progress them and how you develop those skills that you need to see.
That suggestion would be quite attractive to small businesses, wouldn't it, Mr. Jaffa?
No, very much so. But I mean, from our perspective, the bolting on the green skills onto existing skills is critical. But I think the mayor, local council, central government is very good at adding green jargon. And if you're a small business, you hear the words net zero or carbon zero. We need to get away from this and really hone in on what it was we need. We need electronic vehicle charge point installers, we need heat pump engineers, electrical engineers, plumbers, heaters, carpenters, joiners, scaffolders. All these things are jobs, but they link to the green economy, but we're not, because I think we're just too much jargon. Maybe that puts off small businesses when in fact these jobs are the critical ones, and we can bolt on a lot of the training onto these modules.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It seems like zero is a super word unless you apply it to 0 hours contracts. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member Boff. Before we finish that, Alex, if I could just ask you, what impact has the government's levelling up policy had on particular sectors? And I'm thinking about the cultural sector in London, which I know has lost money, and also what effect has the cost of living crisis had on various sectors as well? If you could give us a very quick answer, please.
I'll have a go. Firstly, I should say, by the way, for the record, that if you're looking at growth across the UK, then London does outperform other areas of the UK and has done over the last few years significantly. But so to turn to your question, levelling up, which we might come, in terms of the government's levelling up funds and the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, the short answer is London has been disbenefited enormously from the ending of local enterprise partnership funding, from the ending of EU funding, and the replacement by much smaller pots of funding with strings attached, which my teams and other teams in the GLA are managing, and some of them have been devolved, which is welcome, but there's much less, and that means that generally we have much less scope at City Hall, we might come on to this later, to run the kind of schemes to help people into work and to support small businesses than we have in the past. And that applies again. Obviously, the cultural funding is not my area, but again, it's been well documented that London's been hit quite hard by the latest decisions from the Arts Council for England. So that all, none of that helps. More generally, of course, the cost of living, cost of doing business crisis has adverse effects, and Sam referred earlier. We have some. I'd say actually some of our economic fairness programmes around the London living wage and the good work standard have been quite resilient. We've still got numbers of employers going up overall, and that's welcome because, as Sam implied, it's perhaps a harder sell in tough economic times to look to persuade businesses, big and small, to adopt those sort of working practices, and we're cognisant of that, but numbers are going up. It makes things tougher. When the business environment is very tough, then asking businesses to go the extra mile is not always easy. As Matt was saying, businesses do want to do these kinds of things. Of course, everyone does, but people also worry about the economy. And while growth has been very good, it is fair to say, I'm just looking at the GLA economics figures. The forecasts for this year and next year are pretty poor overall. So businesses are right to be concerned about the sort of short and medium term economic prospects.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Bukhari.
Thank you, Chair. And on LSIP, so I've looked into this as well, and Business London are doing some great work with the DfE at the moment. There's some interesting results coming from that, I hope, as well, that we can look into. And we've talked a lot about the vacancy levels. That kind of connects with the recruitment and the retraining. And Matthew, you were talking about the skills gap and ill health, and others have been talking about housing. So all of these things probably are probably factors with the recruitment and retaining staff with businesses, Matthew. You also mentioned Brexit. You've also talked a little bit about that. So I just want to dive in deeper with that, and you won't be surprised that Lib Dem support Andrew Boff's commitment for freedom of movement as well. So and also the need for easing visa requirements, and I think that I'd like to look into that a little bit more. Did you think that your members would appreciate something more specialised in visas, particularly for young people, specialised visas for young people like they're doing in Australia and Canada and others?
I think what they are after is a one-stop shop where they can get easy to digest information that's accessible. And we already have the London Business Hub that exists, and we've backed for a number of years in its previous guise, London Growth Hub. But I think that's the area in which we need to be smarter in providing information for small businesses, and particularly around things like immigration visas, how they can go and do international visits, attracting talent from different parts of the world, and also, kind of a fund that we've long argued for vouchers, like kind of a Brexit vouchers, we called them originally, but kind of support whereby if they're going to go to trade shows, for instance, so they can operate abroad or look to tap into new markets on the exporting side. We need to be much cleverer, but I think the London Business Hub is probably an untapped resource that probably is best to direct that level of business information through.
Let's talk a bit about the talent aspect. Our businesses will obviously want to attract talent. And how has Brexit impacted on businesses attracting particular talent? And has it impacted the relationship between the private sector, research institutes, universities, that kind of area?
A lot of it is, multifaceted, as we said. With kind of when you speak to businesses, they will say that it's a Brexit-related, pandemic-related, the cost of doing business-related, a host of different factors. But I think if you talk in particular to those businesses that rely on people to come in to fill vacancies, such as low-level skills in hospitality or tourism-related industries, they're the ones who have been impacted most through the changes in through Brexit. But I think in particular, it's businesses where have always found it a challenge to be able to recruit staff. And it's, you look in the catering industry, for instance, it's not necessarily just purely a Brexit-related industry. These are long-term problems that have always been an issue. So we must make it easier for them through the visa system, and by cutting the cost of doing so. If you're paying thousands of pounds as a small business, you're going to be put off right from the get-go. So we think that kind of £1,000 max limit on the kind of, accessing that visa or, applying should be a maximum for any small business.
I'm going to ask a really blunt question, but are your members in agreement that Brexit has been bad for their business?
Can I plead the fifth? It's as I say, we surveyed before the pandemic across the organisation, and it was split in terms of whether they wanted to leave the EU or stay in. I think, again, if you depended on who you ask, how it's impacted, you'll say it's either been a positive or negative issue. We are now where we are. We've been now 7 years down the line from when we left the European Union through the vote. It's now important that all kind of relations we have in all our, say SME chapters, through our engagements and all our partnerships we have with other non-EU countries, they really do think about the SME chapters and have those small business related chapters within their documentation. I think moving forward, it's so important that we have that in all of the negotiations that take place with government and governments from across the world.
Thanks for your answer. Thank you. I think
Sam, I think you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very brief kind of caveat on the visas point, because it's a point we've made in other discussions with colleagues at City Hall, which is just, take as read as a Londoner with family from 4 continents. Migration is lifeblood of a city, but we are worried when there is talk of what could be tied visas. So having worked quite closely with domestic workers on the International Domestic Workers Convention, where we had a tied visa scheme for domestic workers where it left people incredibly open to abuse because their visa was dependent on a single employer, that's a real issue. So when we kind of hear talk around kind of devolved visa schemes for London or individual kind of visa programs in particular kind of areas, we just make that caveat around how it's done and making sure that workers who come in on those visas are not left open to super exploitation because their entire status is dependent on a relationship with one employer. And I say the domestic workers visa scheme shows exactly how not to do it. And just a second point on that, which is the one around it's not just workers coming here. As we know, it's for massively negative impact it's had on people in our creative industry sector and stuff going abroad as well. So I mean, if you talk to any of the colleagues in Musicians Union, Equity, BECTU, which is technicians, the fact that productions, and you made the point around scientific and educational exchanges, are also impacted, but our creative sector in London, as we know, is huge, 1 in 6 jobs, and the fact that tours aren't coming here, they can't move very easily, it's had a massively negative impact, and the fact that we haven't been able to resolve that problem satisfactorily is very significant for a large part of the London economy.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Boff, you thought you might have a supplementary? But if not, we'll move on. Okay, if I could move on to Assembly Member Polanski then.
Thanks, Chair. Matthew, you were talking earlier about green skills and you were saying that it can't just be green jargon, and I agree entirely. For a while now, I've been exposing the gap in the Mayor's plans around retrofitting, that there's this huge retrofit skills gap. He often says to me that it's a chicken and egg situation and that I can't put the money into it until the jobs are there. What levers do you think the Mayor could be pulling, and what do you think are the differences here between kind of a regional strategy and a national strategy to make sure that both workers and businesses are skilled up, ready for green skills?
Well, we've been actively involved, particularly around the commercial retrofit aspect of buildings. That's been a big thing for us as an organisation. But I think, we've long argued that the retrofit issue is one particularly around the ULEZ for us. That's the one that's of most note for us, because we've currently got a situation whereby you have, to scrap a vehicle, it could cost you tens of thousands of pounds, but there are options available where if you retrofit your non-compliant vehicle, it could cost you, say, £8,000, but you get a £5,000 grant. So I think there's more than can be done from the Mayor's office to promote the retrofit aspect, because the issue of ULEZ is becoming, very, very difficult to navigate through. So that's the one side of it. But on the skills system, I think, particularly as you mentioned the issue of jargon, there are so many jobs that we could bolt on to current existing training modules, but I think it's very much these are national frameworks, and I think the Mayor could do more, particularly talking to DFE, on how we could start to bolt on some of these bite-sized chunks of learning that small businesses cry out for that will help them navigate the system. So I think if there's one plea we'd make is that when we're framing qualifications, when we're looking to bolt on them, we make them easy for small businesses where their employees can do it bite-sized, learn quickly, and that we can make them in the long run, jobs that are long-term skills that can benefit the long-term jobs and create sustainable jobs.
Thank you. And green skills aside, is there anything else you would like to see in terms of action to equip people with more skills?
I think it's on the digital skills. I've mentioned leadership and management skills that are they're a vacuum for small businesses, not just in London but across the country. But I think digital skills in particular are lacking in a lot of small businesses. It's the basic skills you have around desk-based jobs. You've got digital marketing, web design skills that businesses are crying out for, but there is a cost to it. And I think tapping into universities, knowledge transfer partnerships, and people coming out with degrees, particularly tapping in this area, those skill sets are really vital. When they leave university, they can help small businesses. So I think right from the get-go, we need to tap into partnerships between universities, colleges, and small businesses. So there are projects where small business says, look, we need to move into this area. Maybe a local university or a local college can help by saying, yes, we can put an academic in there, or an undergraduate, or a knowledge transfer partnership. I think we're lacking because we've got so many different institutions in London that we don't take advantage of them.
Thank you. And just finally, if I can turn to Sam, just on the same question on skills, if there's any action you'd like to see, whether it's around digital skills, green skills, or a whole nother area.
So is that, you did say Sam there, didn't you?
Yes, Sam, sorry.
So I think, there is a huge amount of work going on this at the moment. I think the skills academies, which are kind of badged as part of the kind of COVID recovery work, green skills, digital, social and health, the other two, kind of like developing that work, very important. But it's as we keep making this point and come back to the retrofitting, I keep seeing different estimates on how many jobs we could be creating. Those jobs are going to come into existence. They could be poor quality, 0 hours, very temporary, but someone coming in doing this thing. Or they could be good quality, long-term, leading into skills and training, which will then fit into other bits of resilience for the climate change stuff we know is coming. And so there's a question about, again, how we design that skill system to deliver good jobs and provide those pathways. And I said we think that's part of the fact that in the kind of the language around the Skills Academy, it does talk about making sure that people aren't placed in non-decent work. It talks about making sure that those are jobs which people will be going into from the Skills Academies into kind of jobs which are paying at least for London living wage, etc. We're very pleased that the first member of staff is just coming on stream on a kind of GLA project which will look to rebuild some of the Union Learn employer stuff, which is about unions and employers working together to deliver learning agreements and training. And so that's a really positive thing, which is being supported by the GLA, first member of staff on that, hopefully starting in September. But it's going to take work. It's going to take, again, joined up work, and this is the kind of coherence point across London boroughs, across the work of the GLA. Matt was talking about around the kind of how we're going to handle retrofitting in the commercial sector, which is going to be vast. But if you look at just the social housing stock in London, and millions of units or hundreds of thousands of units there, then we've been talking to local authorities about how they can upscale where they still exist, direct labour organisations in boroughs to provide kind of good quality jobs which will be trained up to actually do that retrofitting in that. Then you look at what's going to need to happen in the private owned housing sector in London. And again, it's going to take everyone working together to deliver that, but it's going to take you need to start from the perspective that anything that has public money going into it should have some goals, which will be about creating decent long-term jobs, not short-term jobs. And there is a lot the Mayor could be doing on that with other colleagues across London.
Well, that's partly my next and final question to you, Sam, is that we talk about a just transition quite a lot nationally, and union workers have to be absolutely at the heart of any just transition. So these are good, union organised, well-paid, good quality jobs. That's obviously the national strategy in terms of, or that should be the national strategy. It's not the national strategy, but it could be. What is the Mayor's role within that in terms of speaking out for Londoners and making sure that Londoners are at the heart of that transition?
So I think fundamental to that is making sure that the right people have a seat at the table in the discussions around what that's going to look like, and the governance and the kind of architecture of that. So that's making sure that businesses, but also workers and other people with kind of key stake in that are actually part of that process. And so we were just contributing to the review that I'm going to get my initials wrong on this, the London Sustainable Development Commission were just doing a review on what the governance architecture around just transition should look like. Not sure if the final report of that's come out, but we did quite a lot of work to kind of make sure that the points from the kind of union just transition stuff were in that, which was no change without people who are going to be affected by it in the room. So communities, but also workers as part of that process. So we're waiting to see what that looks like. In fact, the email I just sent just before I left the office was to a colleague somewhere in City Hall who's working on the resilience, for longer term resilience kind of review for London. And again, that was a conversation around making sure that we are, from a TUC, making sure they're plugged into the right unions. So that expertise is actually kind of going into that discussion. So it's making sure that the expertise of those voices is actually heard. We're optimistic that that's starting to be looked at, but I wouldn't say we're confident about it yet, Zach, because we're feeding in, but it's kind of, we'll see what comes out of it. We're arguing that some of that stuff should be discussed at the London Partnership kind of board. Obviously, the Assembly's going to have an absolutely crucial role in kind of supervising that and making sure that the right connections are being made. It's a work in progress, but we're trying to help with making sure that the right people from our side are in the room.
Good to hear it's heading in the right direction. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. We now come on to our final section, which is about mayoral programmes. And Assembly Member Hirani, if you'd like to start.
Thank you, Chair. So my question, first of all, is to Alex. What action has the Mayor taken to support Londoners into work since the pandemic, and what impact has this work had?
Thanks very much, Assembly Member Hirani. So I should maybe start off by saying there's some areas of work that I'm directly responsible for, and I'll say a bit about those, and then some areas of responsibility that relate to the skills and employment team, and I can say a bit about that as well, although if you check me on the detail, I'll probably have to resort to getting back to you in writing. Actually, the first thing I just wanted to draw to the committee's attention, really, because I think it's often overlooked, is that since we're now in the final year of the European Social Fund programmes that operate in London, and those that ESF programme is worth over £850 million, half EU money, half match funding, and the way we run those programmes is there's things that we support directly, they bring their own match funding, but we also have a lot of big activity with so-called co-financing organisations, and those are like organisations like the Department for Work and Pensions, and through them we run employment schemes that assist troubled families, assist older workers, through the Education Skills Funding Agency, and through them we run schemes that support young people and people in employment to upskill, run schemes of the National Lottery Community Fund that support, this is not the right language now, but at the time it was written, the so-called hardest to reach groups, but what they actually mean are refugees, carers, people with mental health conditions and so on. Work with the prison service to support offenders and ex-offenders. The GLA has its own programmes that are targeted at the unemployed and economically inactive. We're working with boroughs and sub-regional partnerships with sort of work and health programmes. And all those programmes, to date, have supported over 300,000 Londoners. Over 67,000 Londoners have gained qualifications through those ESF schemes. Over 55,000 adults have gained employment on leaving. Over 20,000 Londoners, young Londoners, have gone into employment, education or training. And again, we're always a year or two behind in terms of capturing all the results. So there's more to come, I think. So those large programmes have really been quite successful in supporting Londoners into education, employment or training. Of course, in addition to that, we also have the adult education budget, which is managed through the Skills and Employment Unit. There's some big programmes there that have so far supported 100,000 people into better economic outcomes, which could be moving it again, could be education, employment or training. Learners have, 96% of learners have seen a boost in well-being, confidence or social integration as a result of these. Since May 2016, so that's not, your question was about the pandemic, but I don't have a breakdown for that. The Mayor's created over 330,000 jobs. That's jobs created, supported or safeguarded, and apprenticeship starts. And around 47,000 of those were people supported into work through skills and employability programmes. 9,500 were apprenticeship starts. So there's a lot going on. I mean, if you were to break that down into individual programmes, of course you'd find some programmes were more successful than others. We're always trying to learn and we're always trying to do better.
And what are the sort of main challenges and barriers that you faced in delivery?
Well, post-pandemic, of course, it was everything to do with trying to deliver programmes that, again, in the past would rely on people coming to a physical place and doing, so initially, from 2019, there was a big challenge in terms of moving from programmes that assisted people in person to assisting programmes online. And again, I guess you'd find there's probably a mixed track record for programmes that actually turned out to work even better when they were online, and others that weren't so great. I think the challenge is always in an economy and with a population as diverse as London's to ensure that we are finding, there is huge diversity between different ethnic groups, between people with disabilities and others. So to ensure that we are targeting the funding at those who need it the most, I'd say, is always a sort of ongoing challenge. But one I think that the results show we're doing well at. It's not just the case that these programmes support people who would have found work anyway. We're dealing with people who, in some cases, have been economically inactive for a long time.
Obviously, it's also a bit of a complicated picture in terms of the policy landscape and all the public bodies involved in supporting people in this area, from government to local authorities to yourselves. And is there anything in your perspective in terms of powers or funding that would support you to better enable you to improve those outcomes for Londoners?
Well, it's interesting what something Becky was saying earlier about having, and we didn't rehearse this, I promise, when she sort of said, the one thing useful that the Mayor could do would be to have, to sort of be able to sort of signpost to improve how we do, because actually, whether it's on the skills funding side, where we've got this no wrong door approach, where again, the big government organisations, boroughs, sub-regional partnerships are all working more closely, so that if somebody comes along and says, I've got an issue, you direct them immediately to the correct form of advice they may require. And exactly the same approach we're now taking and rolling out soon in relation to the business hub work that Matthew referred to. I mean, oddly enough, I was having said at the beginning that, of course, a lot of funding schemes are coming to an end. That myriad of funding schemes have also contributed to there being a plethora of different ways of accessing funding. As those schemes end, it becomes even more important that we are able to sort of direct people to the funds that remain. It maybe does become a little bit easier to understand that landscape. So I think that's why we've been putting a lot of effort into working jointly through vehicles like the London Recovery Board, now the London Partnership Board, through with boroughs, with unions, with business support organisations, to come up with a more unified offer. And that was what the Mayor said in his manifesto, that we try and provide a single front door for business and skills advice. And I think by the time we get to the end of this year, we'll have some good results for how we're achieving that.
So just to delve into that transition from ESF to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, has that impacted any targets that you would have for getting Londoners trained or into work, or does it mean there's a sort of scaled down ambition as a result of sadly the funding situation?
Well, essentially it's scaled down. For those who aren't aware, I should say, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is the replacement for EU programmes. It's a 3-year programme. It started nearly a year late because government was late running the programmes up. It's 144 million quid over 3 years. That's a lot less than the billion quid we had over 7 years for the EU programmes, plus the 400 million pounds we had over the last few years for local enterprise partnerships. So it is much smaller. And with people and skills funding, we had the additional, slightly nonsensical thing that the government, for reasons they've still never explained, said that you could only use people and skills funding, which is essentially the replacement for the European Social Fund, from 2024 onwards. to create one-year programmes. Only in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland had it for 3 years. Then earlier this year, the government changed its mind, said, OK, you can have it for 2 years after all. But of course, we've now all set our investment plans for the next 3 years, so it's a bit late now. But, you know, again, to get to the upside, there's 38 million quid we're putting into people and skills funding for next year. 25 million will be used to support economically inactive and unemployed people, and that will be routed through sub-regional partnerships and London boroughs. That should help 7,000 Londoners who are economically inactive, with around 3,000 people expected to get into employment, and £13 million is going to be used to support around 6,500 young people, and 2/3 of that money will focus on employment support programmes for young Londoners not in employment, education or training, so the people we really want to get to. So, you know, the money's there, but I mean, there's no getting way round for the fact it's very scaled down by comparison with what we've been able to do before.
Okay. And what progress has been made in relation to your plans on the UK Shared Prosperity Fund so far?
So that money, that people and skills funding, I said that's not even because we, you know, whereas our other funding, UK SPF funding for communities in place, sort of regeneration funding for small businesses, has now got off the ground, and we've signed funding agreements with businesses that are now getting those projects up and running. For UK SPF, that won't happen until next year. I mean, to some extent, we do still have European Social Fund programmes running, so you know it's not the case that there's absolutely nothing happening right now. But you know, absolutely, in an ideal world, we would have had much larger sums of funding coming in sooner to replace the ESF programmes that are ending now.
And have the targets for that been set yet, or not yet?
So those are the they were agreed in the UK SPF investment plan, which we sent to government and which we can share with the committee if it's of interest. Yeah. And it's those targets I mentioned earlier. So 7,000 Londoners into work, 6,500 young Londoners into employment, education and training.
Okay. And do you feel that London's receiving its fair share of UK Shared Prosperity Fund?
No.
No. Easy one. Okay.
I mean, and in short, because the original rhetoric around this was that EU funding would be replaced with funding of equivalent size, and that's not happened. I mean, it's not happened in London. It's not happened in other parts of the country either.
Yeah. Well, there were all sorts of promises made, then I think. But I think I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Hirani. Assembly Member Boff.
Just finish off on that. So that 300 million is part of the grant from government, is that for AEB?
Yeah, it's devolved to.
It's devolved, but it comes from government.
Yes, that's correct.
And the 38 million that you're allocating on schemes, that also is from that's from the UK.
That's from the UK government. Yes.
Shared
the replacements to EU
fund.
funds.
So when you say it's the mayor allocating it, the mayor's just handing it from the government to those organisations.
Well, it's a bit more. Well, again, and depending on your views on, you know, what in both the cases of AEB, I believe, which I'm less familiar with, but certainly in the case of UK SPF, what we were required to do was agree a plan with stakeholders, and the London government set out who those stakeholders were. It included every London MP, it included London boroughs. We submitted that plan to government. They then sat on it for 4 or 5 months and then said it was okay. So, you know, there is a process by which government is looking at how we intend to use the money, which is not unreasonable, although I'd argue them sitting on it for a few months was unhelpful.
That's great. I mean, it's just, you know, sometimes you see these hoardings going up as saying supported by the Mayor for London, and I know for a fact there isn't a chequebook that's got Mayor for London on it. And it would be nice if they occasionally said and supported by the UK government as well, because that's where the money comes from. Anyway,
I think the UK SPF rules do require that it will say government and it will say Mayor of London. So they'll both be
good on the UK SPF, which is anyway. How does the mayor work with Mr. Conway? How does the mayor work with key stakeholders, including the Department of Work and Pensions and London boroughs, to support Londoners into work?
Well, since I've been working at the GLA for more than 10 years now, one of the things that we've seen big improvements on over time is our joint working with government departments and with boroughs. I alluded earlier, to the sort of European Social Fund money, where again, in other parts of the country, Department for Work and Pensions basically run these programmes, civil servants run these programmes without much reference to local need. I think it would be fair to say. In London, these programmes are run jointly. There was meaningful devolution in terms of when we wanted to point the programmes in certain ways. I mean, there was a negotiation. I wouldn't say we got everything that we wanted, but in fairness, DWP colleagues were very open to saying that in London there are arguments for doing things differently. And I think we've got much better as well at work, through vehicles like the London Partnership Board, at working jointly with boroughs, so that sub-regional partnerships, which of course are groups of boroughs, receive both European and domestic funding to run their own programmes, and we're now also through UK SPF supporting boroughs directly as well. So there's more joining up than there's ever been. That means that things sometimes take a little bit longer to get off the ground, and things can be a little bit messy because you're talking to 33 different boroughs and people have different points of view. But I think the end product is hopefully better in terms of kind of removing duplication and a sort of shared sense of purpose.
How does the Mayor use those use that engagement with stakeholders to forward the idea that everybody should be on the London living wage? There's always a balance to be struck, isn't there, between do you kind of say, well, if you're looking at business support programs, we'll only support you, for example, if you decide to pay the London living wage. That's not the kind of thing that we've decided to do. Why not?
I think whenever we're engaging with businesses.
But that sounds like an incredibly reasonable request to me.
Well, Matt might have a view on that. I think I think our line is always to encourage that kind of involvement, but whether it would be reasonable to require it is perhaps another question.
Well, I'm not so sure about that.
Colleagues may have different views on that.
Yeah.
I think the to require it would exclude a lot of businesses who are working towards it. So I think that element that the flexibility is important.
Allow people to catch up, but I would hope it's part of the conversation.
It is part of the conversation,
and
absolutely.
And it's emphasised that that's where we need to go. Ever since the last mayor pushed the London living wage, there's been progress, and we wouldn't want to lose sight of that progress.
No, and worth saying, as I said earlier, that progress kind of continues to remind myself of the stats on the living wage. At the moment, we've got 300,000, over 325,000 people now, Londoners now benefiting from the living wage. Nearly 3,500 living wage employers. So the figures are going up and again. Not scared about saying exponentially now, but they're certainly going up a lot.
It's a big word,
and we hope that they'll continue to go up a lot. And even in the last month, I know we've signed up more. The number of people we're employing, both taking the living wage and to utilise the Mayor's Good Work Standard, continues to go up.
Thank you. Actually, I've got a lot more questions, but I'm not going to ask them now.
That's a very, very good idea, Assembly Member Boff. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you, Alex. I want to ask about the Deputy Mayor for Business, who was invited today, but sadly couldn't make it. But what is his role to support businesses and workers in London, and what impact has his work had?
So I guess the Deputy Mayor's got sort of several different hats in Israel, and I think none of them would surprise members of the committee. So one is being the sort of conduit for conversations with businesses, big and small. And of course, we have a number of kind of business advisory groups and things like that, but also a lot of kind of ad hoc. The Mayor receives a lot of, and the Deputy Mayor, a lot of invitations to participate in different kind of business stakeholder events, and we try to go to as many. He'll try to go to as many as he can. So there's just that being the sort of voice of business, and then that's something we've seen quite a lot of in the last year or two are kind of letters. For example, recently around the I don't want to call it the tourist tax, which I know is the campaign, but the campaign to restore the VAT cut that actually has been something which the Mayor and businesses have been jointly working, lobbying government to sort of change. And so, you have the sort of discussions with stakeholders where we say, well, where can the Mayor use that sort of, and Deputy Mayor use that bully pulpit to sort of amplify the voice of business around things we'd like to see. We've been talking about sort of visa changes, immigration rules. There's a lot of strong views around that as well, around the regional shortage occupation list and so on. So there's that sort of political side to things. There's a bit of just kind of going out and about to different bits of London, looking at different workspaces, different sorts of businesses and sort of conversations that we have there. Then there's the Deputy Mayor's former role as Chair of London and Partners, which of course, and we can come on to sort of LNP's role if it's of interest to the committee, but that's a whole sort of job in itself. And indeed, of course, part of being Chair of London Partners also is part of going out and about and banging the drum for London, as we say, in encouraging foreign direct investment, encouraging small businesses from London to expand overseas. And we've got, again, the fairly well-established Mayor's International Business Programmes and so on. So we've seen trips, during this administration to America, India and so on to promote businesses there. So does that give a sort of idea of...
Yeah, I don't know if you answered the question about what impact he's had, but I'm supposing it's hard to measure. But are there any measurable impacts you have?
Well, it's supposed so. In terms of London and Partners programmes, we've got loads. And in terms of GVA added, I mean, I'm pretty sure if the Deputy Mayor was here, he wouldn't want to suggest that was all down to him personally. But in terms of the organisation to which that he chairs and ultimately responsible, I think there's a very good story to tell in relation to London and Partners impact.
Thank you. On the adult education budget, just finally. The Mayor often talks proudly about the flexibility within it, but that almost implies that it's a reactive kind of mechanism. What space do you think there is for a more proactive adult education budget? So it's less about helping individual businesses and more about looking at the kind of economy as a whole system.
Now, I hate to, but because don't work in the skills and employment unit and I'm not directly responsible for the adult education budget, I don't want to give a kind of bum steer on this, but my understanding about a lot of the adult education budget is it is quite tightly constrained by government. So, it's a big, it's a lot of money that's been devolved, but in reality, a lot of that money must go to support certain types of activities, certain types of work, the continuation of FE colleges, apprenticeship schemes and so on. So I'm sure that we would love to have a bigger budget that would allow for a bit more kind of strategic thinking and growth, but I'm I think it's fairly tightly constrained is my feel.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. You'll be delighted to hear that because you've all been so restrained in your questions and answers that we've almost caught up time-wise. The final question that I have to ask... So, sabotage by Assembly Member Garrett. Please, could you make it quick?
It will be very quick. It's more of an observation than a question. People love it when you start like that, don't they? So I'm really warming everyone up. So, notwithstanding the wonderful eulogy, perhaps that's the wrong word, to our wonderful Deputy Mayor that we've just heard, I can't remember the last time I saw him. I don't think we've seen him in this year. I don't think we saw him in the previous year when Assembly Member Kari chaired this committee. I don't think he came before the committee when I chaired it at the back end of the year before that. I do recall seeing him when Assembly Member Bailey was chairing the committee. That was back when we were in Old City Hall, which feels like a very long time ago. And perhaps we could write to him and just invite him to come and tell us himself how wonderful he is, because he has paid quite a lot of money and has quite a lot of responsibility. And if he never turns up, it's a great shame that either we can't hear from him in person how great he is, or equally we have the opportunity to scrutinise him as to how great he possibly is. So I'd just like to put on record that I think it's disappointing that we've invited him and he hasn't come.
Thank you, Assembly Member Garrett. There is a and I've accepted it as a very reasonable reason for not being here today. But just to correct you slightly, the last time we saw him was actually when we were at Union Street. So it was about a year and a half ago. You're quite correct. What I was going to say, actually, but perhaps I could say this now, is Alex, you talked about some of the, some of the things that the Deputy Mayor has achieved as a result of banging the drum for London. I wonder if we could ask him to write to us to tell us exactly what those achievements are, because I think that would be useful, and to reassure you, Assembly Member Garrett, and the panel, and the committee as a whole. The Deputy Mayor will be asked again in future to attend, but thank you for raising that. So, moving on to the final question, and this is a question for all of the panel, and if you could just do it maybe in a couple of bullet points. What further action would you like to see from the Mayor and central government to get more people into work in London and to support London businesses? Starting with you, Sam.
Got 5 bullet points down here. I was smiling wryly when Alex was talking about UK SPF, because with my LEAP hat on, I used to be involved in that with Alex. And the programme is definitely less now. So, just in terms of where we could go now, so it's as much getting people into good jobs as jobs. I said, I think getting people into jobs in London, our economy will hopefully be taking off again, so it's for good jobs bit. So I think there's some leading by example, which the GLA has been doing on the good jobs front, which could be expanded. So the fact that we're at the forefront, GLA was at the forefront of pay gap reporting, not just on gender, but on disability and on ethnicity as well, incredibly important, and we need to see that spreading across all employers, public and private, in London. We think there is a lot more the Mayor could do and the GLA could do to support insourcing, which we see as being a really key way of improving conditions. So particularly at the moment, I would obviously use the example of the TfL cleaning contract, which is up at the moment, ABM. We would very much like to see those several thousand cleaners brought back in-house. There are some other contracts in the GLA which are outsourced at the moment. We would think that would lead to those people being put onto above the London living wage issues around sick pay, etc., which would be solved by bringing them back in-house. And to come back to Assembly Member Boff's point on the London living wage, some really concrete stuff around there, around procurement, how the GLA Families Procurement Code is used to make sure that those kind of decent work things, including adherence to the London living wage and being on the pathway to it, is absolutely kind of implemented. We have the London living wage city campaign, which the Mayor co-chairs with the Bishop of London, and I think I'm right in saying it's a senior director at KPMG. It could be another one of those firms, apologies if it is, but which is not funded by the GLA, it's funded by Trust for London, but some really concrete work there which the GLA is doing on living wage and living wage places, like where we are here in the Royal Docks. The Royal Docks was the first living wage place zone. That needs to be carried through into actual action, see that going. So some absolute kind of leading by example which the GLA and the wider GLA family could do. And then the convening power. I mean, the convening power we talked about to bring together businesses, unions and others in London across key sectors. We think there's a lot more that could be done there to actually build on the links that were developed during COVID and the pandemic, various business recovery bodies, but we could pull that knowledge together, pull those relationships together, keep working on that to see decent work improving in those sectors which have got the biggest decent work deficits.
Thank you, and you'll be interested to hear, because you were talking about pay gaps, that the Assembly actually very recently passed and agreed a motion on asking for an ethnicity pay gap monitoring role for all employers across London who have over 250 employees. Thank you. Naomi.
So, kind of first point, given what we've spoken about this afternoon around the kind of challenges in terms of economic inactivity, we know nationally that only 1 in 10 disabled people or older people are actually accessing employment support. So I think work on both the national level and within London to widen eligibility and access to employment support for more more people. And I think things, the work that's being done with sub-regional partnerships and local authorities to extend things like the Work and Health programme is incredibly welcome, as is the work around the kind of no wrong door initiative. I think within that, we also need to find a way to better support people into the right jobs too. So, nationally we have, effectively a work first approach. What more can we do to support people to find the right jobs for them, kind of good quality jobs with progression opportunities? And I think kind of the collaboration and integration of services is really important there, and kind of continuing to support the integration of work and health services, particularly given what we've seen in terms of the health and mental health trends. I also think, and this is something that we thought was missing from the spring budget, there could be more work, and I know there is a lot going on within London, but more work with employers to promote inclusive, flexible workplaces. And I mentioned, obviously, there is a lot of work ongoing within London. Got the Good Work Standard, the kind of integration hubs, lots of work. I think if we could better kind of monitor the kind of impacts and kind of understand the impacts of those initiatives, I think that would be really helpful in terms of thinking about the kind of future design of those programmes and where next.
Thank you very much. Matthew?
Yeah, so we need to kickstart the apprenticeship programmes in London again. We need to get employers employing apprentices, and that's through an apprenticeship grant for employers. It has been done in the past at mayoral level. We want to see that come back. The levy underspend amongst the apprenticeship levy, only 25% can be spent amongst larger businesses to the small businesses. That should be ramped up to 100%. So mayor putting pressure again on central government. Procurement, we mentioned the procurement system of getting small businesses along the journey, and that means supply chains helping their small businesses take on staff. And finally, the big one, paying small businesses on time, prompt payment, making London a prompt payment capital. It stems from that. It's a chain reaction, and if we could start to nip that in the bud, we'd see a flow of things happening in the right way, and it stems from businesses being paid on time.
Thank you. Becky?
I'm going to pick up on the training point and thinking about Matthew's earlier points about how we need to get better bolt-ons for some of these green skills, and that's a big national programme. But actually we've got a model in terms of the boot camps where sort of more localised provision can evolve. So I hope there's ways that the Mayor can leverage some of that funding and put the challenge to training providers to work with employers to establish a sort of short bolt-on training provision that will help workforces adapt to the new green skills challenge. I'd like to see better integration between health and work systems, improving employment support for people who are currently economically inactive. I think the Mayor can make a big difference from those who are not currently engaged in the employment system and perhaps working through the health system, and bringing the collaboration between the two can help people move towards employment and start to bring and gain the skills they need to get on in work. And I'd like to see sort of more work in the, I think it's the work integration networks and hubs. There's a lot there around trying to skill up London's more diverse communities, London's lower levels of qualifications, and bring them towards growth sectors in the economy. And I think doing more of that and increasing the diversity and the focus not simply on getting in but getting on in work and finding equity in chances of getting on in work are really important endeavours.
Thank you. Alex, did you want to answer this?
Well, I'll make the sort of obvious plea for sort of more devolution, more cash, but otherwise just to say that all the ideas that colleagues on the table just said, are all very sensible, and this is definitely an area where, this is not about City Hall having all the answers. It's about working in partnership. We talked about the local skills improvement partnership. Are there these other ideas about how we ensure that we get the combined wisdom of stakeholders to come up with kind of, and that's how we'll ultimately run the best sort of programs that will help get the most people into work. So look forward to carrying on working with everybody, and that includes observations from committee colleagues as well, which are very welcome.
Thank you. That's a very positive note to end on. So we've now come to the end of this session. I'd like to thank our excellent panel for the really interesting, detailed answers that you've given, which I've personally found incredibly enlightening and really helpful. I'd like you, if you don't mind, just stay for a couple of minutes. We've got a couple more things to do, because we now have a tradition of taking a photo with the panel members. And yes, we've done it twice, so now it's a tradition. And well, it is in my house, so. Can I ask the committee now to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from this discussion? Can I ask the committee to note its work programme?
On that, Chair. Bearing in mind the contribution from Mr. Jaffa, is it not a good idea perhaps to up the priority of the late payments suggestion that I had for the work programme, to actually perhaps bring it forward?
Could we have the discussion offline?
Sure.
Yeah, and perhaps you and I could have a conversation with the committee services as well. Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 13th of September. It isn't going to be at City Hall. It is actually a round table, and it's a further discussion of what we've looked at today, but in detailed and more in-depth way. So we don't have a venue for that yet, but we will do shortly, and it will be publicised. I have no business that I regard as urgent today, so this now concludes today's meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.
Photo.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.